In the end, the story of his birth and life in that world before the flood reads less like an isolated miracle and more like a long experiment in ethical living under pressure. He was neither a lone prophet in the sense of a solitary visionary nor merely a local sage. He was a person whose daily acts modeled a persistent alternative to short-sightedness and greed. His life teaches that moral influence often grows quietly, through consistency, care, and the transmission of habits across generations. The world he inhabited was rich and fragile, filled with both beauty and looming catastrophe, and his life was a testament to the possibility of steady light in the face of gathering storms. This story of a man living with steady values before the flood still speaks to us today. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if what inspires you more is his quiet courage or his everyday care for others. There are moments in the hush before dawn when the world seems to hold its breath, and in that stillness a single life can change the course of time. Enoch belongs to one of those moments, a figure whose existence is stitched into an old memory that stretches farther than the hills of his home. He is named and almost defined by an action more than an occupation, the simple verb that becomes a lifetime: he walked with God. That phrase carries a life's rhythm, a steady pace measured not in steps but in companionship. Imagine the terrain where Enoch lived, a landscape of river plains and low hills, human settlements breathing in the warm dust of ordinary days. People milled about their chores, tending flocks, building houses, engaging in commerce, and slowly forgetting the fragile thread that ties a soul to the divine. Into that ordinary world Enoch moved in such a way that his presence altered the air. He did not merely speak about God or recite traditions. His life suggested a continuous dialogue, a walking together that shaped the way he saw the sky and the people before him. To walk with God is not only an inward truth but an outward practice, a manner of existing that informs how one treats neighbors and strangers alike. Enoch's walk created patterns in the community. His choices became the ripples that rearranged social mores, a living argument that virtue was not archaic. Yet he was not a zealot shunning the world. Rather, he stood within it, a conduit whose presence carried an expectation. That expectation did not announce itself like a trumpet. It threaded through conversations, gestures, and acts of care until it became unmistakable. There must have been moments when Enoch felt lonely on this path, when the cost of conviction demanded sacrifice. Walking with God often isolates a person from the noisy consensus, but the loneliness is not simply abandonment, it is a kind of thinness in which inner vision sharpens. In those thin hours Enoch received impressions that would later be called visions, not cinematic spectacles but inner illuminations that reorganized his sense of purpose. Each impression carried detail, a texture of clarity that told him history was not merely a human affair but interwoven with a larger, unseen pattern. These visions, when they came, were not merely private keepsakes. They functioned like letters from a distant shore, bearing instructions and intimations about what was to come. Enoch described things that unsettled and comforted, warnings and explanations articulated with a confidence that suggested a direct line of communication. In fragments preserved and echoed by later writers, such visions speak about judgment and mercy, about the cosmic order that sustains the world, and about the way human action bends toward ruin or redemption. Enoch's role became that of a witness who charted the contour of both doom and deliverance. One of the most enduring images attached to Enoch is the meeting of heaven and earth, a scene in which celestial beings and human reality touch without dissolving either. It is a meeting that neither severs creation from its maker nor reduces the divine to mere metaphor. Enoch's perception of that meeting offered him responsibilities: to warn against moral drift, to describe the arrogance of the powerful, and to hold up a vision of what justice could look like. He did this with a voice that was both prophetic and tender, refusing to allow fear alone to guide his warnings. The idea of walking with God implies movement, and movement implies purpose. Enoch's steps were bent toward a future that bore both consequence and consolation. He spoke in images that suggested judgment on corruption, and he prophesied about a judgment that would refine rather than merely destroy. That is to say, his visions contained paradoxes, sternness toward what was harmful, and an abiding hope for restoration. His was a vocation of both critique and construction. Some traditions expand Enoch's story into long corridors of detail, providing names and episodes, genealogies and dialogues that extend the man's life into epic proportions. Whether one treats those expansions as literal histories or as mythic elaborations, they serve a purpose. They illuminate how his contemporaries and later generations tried to understand the relationship between a life lived close to the divine and the wider arc of human history. In these accounts, Enoch remains a hinge, where heaven's will and human possibility meet and test one another. There is something deeply domestic about Enoch's walk, something that anchors the miraculous in the commonplace. He was not portrayed as floating above his family but as present within it, a husband and father whose piety shaped home life. The discipline of prayer and the priority of justice manifested in the way he raised children, taught neighbors, and resolved disputes. This domestic fidelity becomes an argument in itself. Holiness is not an escape from community but a refining presence within it. Enoch's prophetic voice also holds another quality, one that distinguishes him from the thunderers who denounce with blazing rhetoric. His words moved like steady river water, eroding but also nourishing, persistent and patient. He called people to repentance not by mere condemnation but by telling a story of belonging to something larger than themselves. He invited his hearers to imagine a reordered society, a community that mirrored the harmony of the divine realm he had glimpsed. The vision that accompanied his calling gave him perspective on time itself. Enoch seemed to experience layers of history simultaneously, seeing consequences that would unfold generations hence while staying rooted in immediate obligations. To live with that kind of foresight is to bear a weight, because foresight clarifies what matters now and makes later losses feel intolerable if they can be prevented. Enoch carried that burden willingly, and it made his warnings both urgent and compassionate. Walking with God can be a singularly private experience, yet Enoch's walk became a social force because he shared its fruits: compassion, reform, and communal discipline. He taught people to see one another differently, to regard strangers not as disposable obstacles but as reflections of sacred worth. His influence went beyond moral exhortation. It shaped institutions, law, and the rhythm of worship in ways that made the society he inhabited feel like an extension of his vision. Those changes were not immediate or total, but they endured as testimony to what one life can do. There are accounts that depict Enoch's community as crystalline in its righteousness, a city that rose in harmony with the divine. That image serves as both an ideal and a challenge. It confirms that human societies can approximate divine justice while admitting that such communities require vigilance. The city he built was not meant to isolate itself from human pain. It was a discipline in which the people practiced mercy. The story of that city remains a beacon for those who wonder whether a collective life ordered by conscience is possible. Not all the world welcomed Enoch's vision. Power resists the gaze that exposes exploitation, and wealth often finds the language of virtue inconvenient. Enoch's critique unsettled the comfortable and provoked the unjust to defensive cruelty. Yet even resistance becomes a sort of testimony, because opposition clarifies stakes and reveals hidden loyalties. Through confrontation, Enoch's message gained a sharper edge, one that made his conviction more palpable to those who had been indifferent before. There is a particular intensity to prophetic protest when it implicates familiar faces, and Enoch did not spare the wealthy or the influential from his indictment. He warned that illusions of security would ultimately fail and that arrogance would crumble under the weight of its own cruelty. Those warnings were not abstract metaphors, they were grounded in observable practices: exploitation, neglect, and the fetishizing of power. His aim was not revenge but reformation, a relentless demand that people remember how to be humane. The language of Enoch's visions often moved beyond ethical admonition into cosmic scale, painting images of heavenly courts and divine assemblies where the fate of humanity is deliberated. These visions gave him a role that looked less like a local reformer and more like a cosmopolitan witness, someone who could stand before both earth and heaven and speak truth. That dual perspective infused his pronouncements with gravity, as if his words carried the weight of decisions made in realms beyond human sight. It is a humbling thought that ordinary lives might be touched by such expansive realities. And yet, in spite of celestial drama, there is tenderness in the way Enoch relates to the fragile and the marginal. His concern is not merely abstract cosmic balance, but the pain of individuals, the broken and the bereaved. He listened to cries that others muffled, and he translated those cries into a moral language that demanded redress. His compassion was not sentimental, it was structural, aimed at dismantling causes of suffering rather than merely soothing symptoms. Because Enoch walked closely with God, he became a point of reference for those who wrestled with doubt. Faith, in his case, was not a denial of uncertainty, it was a practice practiced in the midst of it. He acknowledged mystery without capitulating to cynicism, and in that way his life provided a model for those who seek spiritual integrity amid an unruly world. His walk with God held together awe and accountability in a way that felt authentic and accessible. The esoteric elements of his visions, angels, cosmic upheavals, and images of judgment, might tempt listeners to relegate Enoch to the category of mythic archetype, but the core of his story remains deeply ethical. The celestial visions serve as magnifications of earthly realities. Greed becomes demonic, compassion becomes luminous, and avoidance of responsibility takes on apocalyptic consequences. In this way, the extraordinary language of prophet speak refracts ordinary human choices into sharper moral optics. Stories about Enoch reach across millennia not because of the strange images they contain, but because they address perennial human anxieties: why evil persists, whether justice will come, and how one person can make a difference. His visions answer these anxieties by insisting that human choices matter and that there is moral order woven into reality. That assertion neither denies suffering nor trivializes it. Instead, it suggests that the arc of existence is not indifferent but responsive to human agency when aligned with divine intent. There are moments in Enoch's story when the sky itself seems to open and the boundary between worlds thins to a filament. Those episodes are narrated with a kind of reverence that makes silence feel appropriate in response. He did not rush into the spectacle for personal exaltation. He approached the threshold with the same humility that marked his ordinary life. The ascension that various traditions recount becomes less a dramatic evacuation and more a consummation of a lifelong conversation, an ending that is the natural completion of a walk that never stopped being conversational. Enoch's departure from the human scene is narrated in tones of wonder and invitation. Some accounts say he was taken so that he would not experience death as others do. Others suggest that his translation was exemplary evidence of a life aligned to its highest calling. The image of being taken up evokes both loss and promise. For those who remain feel grief, but also inherit a story that reshapes their moral imagination. Enoch's removal is thus paradoxically enlarging, converting private grief into public hope. After his ascent, Enoch did not vanish into irrelevance, but rather became a voice that resonated through later texts and traditions. His name surfaces in unexpected places, held up by writers who saw in him an exemplar of divine intimacy and moral courage. The echoes of his life traveled across cultures, languages, and centuries, becoming a resource for those who sought evidence that the divine can be known closely and that a single life can tilt the arc of history. He becomes, in a sense, a touchstone for how people imagine possibility. It is important to acknowledge that many details of Enoch's story are contested, shifted, and amplified as it passes through different historical communities. Each retelling filters the man through the concerns of its moment, projecting contemporary anxieties and hopes on an ancient figure. Yet beneath the variations there remains a core shape, a person whose practice of walking with God produced moral courage and prophetic clarity. That core is why readers and listeners across eras find themselves drawn to his narrative. The textual traces of Enoch are curious things, combining genealogical notes with long visionary passages that seem to have been added to and reworked across time. Scholars debate how these texts formed, but for a listener the fragments are less a problem to solve than an invitation to listen for the voice beneath the words. It is the voice of someone comfortable with mystery yet relentless about justice, someone who insists that the spiritual life bends towards social responsibility. That insistence is what makes Enoch's voice still relevant. There is also a meditative quality to his pictures of heavenly courts and celestial order, as if the cosmic was meant to be contemplated, not exploited. Enoch's vision asked witnesses to consider the architecture of divine governance and to imagine a society formed on those principles. In contemplating such images, we are not meant to escape the present, but to see our actions reflected in a larger moral economy. The invitation is practical, to alter how we live so that our communities resemble the justice we glimpsed in those visions. The effect of Enoch's story on a community is gradual rather than instantaneous. Reform creeps into habits, then into institutions, and finally into generational memory. Those who walked with him learned languages of care and accountability that became second nature. Over time, the ethical shapes he carved into the life of his people produced norms that outlasted his presence, making his influence a kind of cultural DNA. Such endurance suggests that the most potent form of leadership is not coercive but formative. For anyone wrestling with vocation, Enoch's life offers a model of steady attention. Walking with God did not exempt him from doubt, routine, or failure, but it gave his questions a direction. He paid attention to the small moments that together constituted his life, the meals shared, the conversations held in twilight, the reprimands offered in grace, and the acts of kindness that required no reward. Those small moments became the seams by which larger destiny was sown. Enoch's prophetic warnings about judgment have a tenderness baked into them, as if the moral sternness came from a deep desire to preserve life rather than end it. He cried out against practices that would ruin people and communities because he could see the long-term cost before others did. In such a posture there is urgency but also an ethic of prevention, to transform rather than punish, to restore rather than simply to break. That is the heart of a prophetic imagination that walks with compassion. In the quieter parts of his life, Enoch practices what might be called ordinary sanctity, a holiness that bubbles up from the daily discipline of love. He attends to the weak, listens to the troubled, and stands with the oppressed in ways that cost him personally. Those acts of quiet fidelity often go unnoticed by historians but become the marrow of moral memory. They are what turn legend into living legacy. Even the most skeptical listener can learn from the discipline that defined Enoch's walk, an attentiveness to signs, an insistence on ethical clarity, and a willingness to stand alone when need be. Those practices do not require a particular creed to bear fruit, because they are, at heart, human virtues translated by the language of faith into sustained action. Enoch's story thus offers a blueprint for integrity that crosses religious borders. His life also offers an important corrective to triumphal narratives that equate spiritual success with power or status. Enoch's walk with God yields a different metric, proximity to truth and fidelity to justice rather than social ascent. The crowning of his life is not applause but a quiet confirmation that integrity matters more than acclaim. That confirmation is quiet but unassailable, an inner knowledge that a life was well lived even if it escaped the notice of history's loudest voices. As the story reaches its crescendo in the narrative of his translation, the language grows reverent but never self-congratulatory. The ascension scenes are not meant to titillate but to underscore a point: lived intimacy with the divine changes the shape of existence. Enoch's translation, therefore, is symbolic as well as literal, a demonstration that a life tuned to moral music will find resonance beyond measurable time. For listeners, this becomes an invitation to imagine what it would mean to walk in a similar cadence. The echoes of Enoch's life ripple into ethical reflection and spiritual practice, encouraging us to expand our understanding of what it means to be faithful. Whether or not one accepts the literal particulars, the narrative asks whether our own lives might be reoriented toward compassion, accountability, and courageous witness. It invites a curiosity about the ways inner vision could translate into community transformation and how steady fidelity might outlast noisy achievement. To listen to Enoch is to enter a conversation that blends awe and discipline, a dialogue that privileges tenderness over triumph and endurance over spectacle. His life suggests a simple but profound proposition, that walking with God is not about dramatic feats but about the incremental formation of character. It asks us to consider the places where we might be called to bend our lives toward justice and mercy, and to imagine ourselves as companions on a journey rather than solitary heroes. There is something inexhaustible about stories like Enoch's because they return us to questions that cannot be conclusively answered: how to live, what to hope for, and whom to trust when the world grows dark. Yet precisely because these questions resist closure, they continue to shape imaginations and inspire action. Enoch's walking remained an enactment of faith lived in time, a model that continues to teach patience, courage, and the audacity to see beyond the immediately visible. When you find yourself in the middle of an ordinary day, stopped at a light, listening to rain on the roof, making breakfast, you are in a place remarkably similar to the world Enoch inhabited. It is in these everyday moments that a walk with God becomes possible for any person, not as a dramatic escape but as steadfast attention to neighbor and conscience. To adopt such a posture is to participate in a lineage of witness that stretches far and wide, connecting lives across generations through the quiet work of love. So the lasting image of Enoch is not an isolated saint whisked away, but a companion who invites others to walk beside him. His life becomes a corridor through which later generations can travel and from which they can carry tools for moral construction. Each step he took was, in effect, a lesson about courage and compassion, a small ethical experiment that proved replicable and durable. That is why his story continues to be told, not simply as history but as an ongoing call. Call it vision, vocation, or calling, Enoch's experience remains a compelling example of human response to the sense of the holy. He shows us what can happen when ordinary tasks are performed with extraordinary attention, when the rhythm of daily life is governed by ongoing conversation with what one perceives to be sacred. That conversation reshapes priorities and widens the moral imagination until a single life can indeed change the contours of a community. And if you listen closely to the cadence of his walk, you will hear a pattern that might guide your own steps. Watch the little moments, respond to injustice with steadiness rather than fury, let compassion become a habit, and keep your eyes open to glimpses of a larger order. Enoch's vision was not a one-time spectacle but a sustained orientation that transformed how he breathed, spoke, and moved through the world. This is an invitation for any listener who longs to live with purpose and with the courage to make that purpose practical. Enoch's story also challenges assumptions about the solitary nature of spiritual calling by emphasizing that a true walk with the divine inevitably affects others. The inner call spills outward into community life, shaping laws, culture, and the ordinary interactions that define a civilization. His life suggests that genuine spirituality is not an escape from the messy realities of society but the force that purifies them. It reframes holiness as social work performed with a certain inner clarity. Finally, the resonance of Enoch's life across centuries offers a quiet assurance that the moral imagination is not a doomed dream but a powerful engine of change when sustained over time. The disciplines he practiced, charity, discernment, courage, patience, are not exotic virtues but accessible skills to be cultivated. If the world sometimes seems indifferent, his example reminds us that persistence matters, that steady feet and faithful heart can tilt history in surprising directions. Enoch walked with God and in doing so invited the rest of us to ponder what our own walking might look like. His vision and calling were not escapes from reality but clarifications of how to live within it, with hands ready to mend what is broken and hearts open to what is holy. For the listener moving through the ordinary business of life, his story offers a quiet blueprint: live attentively, speak boldly, love relentlessly, and let your steps be steady enough that they might one day make a path for others to follow. In the end, Enoch's legacy is an echo rather than a monument, reverberating wherever people choose to align their daily rhythms with a wider moral order. His life encourages us to think of calling not as a distant thunderclap but as a steady tread that reshapes the ground beneath our feet. If you are tempted to imagine your life as too small to matter, remember that the walk of one person used to reshape a world, and it can do so again. Enoch was a man who walked with God, or so the ancient words tell us, and that phrase alone opens a passage into a world where sky and earth converse. He lived in a time before the flood, when cities were few and names carried weight like stones in a river. To imagine Enoch is to imagine someone who listened to wind and stars with equal attention, someone who learned the language of both. That listening is what led him to the deeper things, to the secrets that would trouble the whole world. The watchers enter the story like a sudden wind tearing through calm water, a company of heavenly beings whose curiosity became a calamity. They were angels charged with watching over humans, teachers, and guardians at first, but their attention turned into desire. They looked at the daughters of men and saw not only beauty but possibility, and what began as observation slipped into transgression. The narrative tightens here, for this is where knowledge and love, law and longing, begin to pull against one another. In early tellings, names appear like keys: Semyaza, the leader who spoke for the others; Azazel, whose teaching would be judged as corruption; others follow, each with a name that echoes some faculty of the cosmos. Names are not merely labels in these stories, they are signatures of function, energy, and intent. When the watchers descend, their descent is both physical and moral, a falling that mirrors the fall of boundaries. You can feel the world change when these beings take wives and teach human beings arts they had not been permitted to learn. What did they teach? That question haunts the texts. They taught metalworking and the secrets of forging, the manipulation of earthly matter that would change cities and war. They taught the knowledge of beautifying the body, cosmetics, and jewelry, which altered how people saw one another and themselves. They taught astrology, the interpretation of heavenly courses, and with that teaching came calendars and dominions, calendars that rearranged how people thought about time and fate. The teachings sound practical, almost benign, until you see the result. The knowledge of metalwork led to weapons of bronze and iron, and sudden capacity for harm. The knowledge of cosmetics and ornament led to vanity and schemes. The knowledge of the heavens led to divination, to claiming that the future could be read like a map. Knowledge itself was not evil, the stories insist, but knowledge without covenant, knowledge that suspends awe before the divine, becomes a weapon against human community. That is the root of the danger the watchers introduced. Enoch's reaction to this contamination is what marks him as different. He does not merely sit and observe, he moves into the interstice between heaven and earth, the place where law, mercy, and the life of the world meet. He is called by God and given visions that take him past the roof of the sky into chambers of light. The Book of Enoch, in its many iterations and fragments, describes these as stairways of flame, as rivers of crystal, as places where the shape of the future is carved into stone. Those descriptions are not just scenic details, they are attempts to render spiritual architecture into images we can hold in the mind. The heavens are presented not as a single place, but as a series of levels, each with its own guardians and functions. Enoch is led through them, not as a tourist, but as an envoy, learning secrets that are considered too heavy for ordinary hearts. At each level, an angel uncovers part of the machinery, the courses of the sun and moon, the limits of the stars, the storehouses of snow and wind. These are not sterile facts either. They are woven into moral and eschatological meaning, explaining how the world maintains its balance and how that balance is disrupted by sin. One of the most urgent revelations involves the fates of the Watchers themselves. God's judgment moves with a deliberate cruelty to those who have overstepped immortal cords. Enoch is shown the pits where the Watchers will be imprisoned, caverns of darkness beneath place and time. He is shown the chains that bind them, the days marked for their ultimate reckoning, and the sorrow that attends punishment. There is no simple triumph here. The texts dwell on a sorrow that is almost sacramental, the recognition that even those who fell possessed a kind of grandeur. And then there are the giants, the Nephilim, the offspring of angels and humans, who move through the world like mountains with teeth. These beings are depicted with both fascination and horror, towering presences who devour the labor of seasons and slaughter men and beasts. The storytellers use them to show what happens when the natural order is violated, when boundaries meant to protect life are dissolved into appetite and power. They become a primary reason, within the narrative, for the flood that will cleanse the earth. The flood itself is not simply an act of wrath, but a cosmic reset, the wiping clean of a ledger that has been misshapen by transgression. Yet in the midst of judgment, Enoch remains a unique mediator, a man who petitions on behalf of the Watchers even as he recognizes the necessity of judgment. His voice is one of pleading, explanation, and sometimes rebuke, because his walk with God made him both tender and severe. He knows that secrecy in heaven carries consequences on earth, and he models a spiritual courage we rarely name with modern words. The secrets Enoch is given are not trivia about the stars, they are ethical blueprints, they are calendars that tell when a season of mercy will end and when a harvest of consequence begins. The luminaries, the sun and the moon, are shown to Enoch as decision-making instruments of a larger plan, their courses regulated by angelic custodians. He sees how the moon deceives and the sun clarifies, how the years are counted and how festivals rise from those counts. Understanding time, the narrative suggests, is a kind of responsibility as heavy as any weapon taught by the Watchers. There is, too, a very human strain in Enoch's vision, grief for a world that will be swept away, yes, but also a fathoming of what it means to be human in the presence of angels. He observes how love can be misdirected, how curiosity can become an instrument of hubris. Those human themes make the cosmic parts of the story resonate. When Enoch looks at the giants, he sees the brutality of unanchored appetite, and when he looks at the heavens, he learns the cost of knowledge without humility. That is the tightrope he walks, the reason his name is whispered with both awe and caution. The Watcher's teachings about the stars create a temptation that reaches into the very concept of prophecy. If you can chart the stars and read signs, then the future seems compressible, as if destiny were a pattern any keen eye could decode. The tradition warns that when people begin to believe they can control outcomes by aligning their wills with certain signs, responsibility is replaced by illusion. Prophecy becomes self-serving, watchfulness mutates into control. Enoch's insight into this is part of why he is shown the courts of heaven, so he can learn how divinity preserves freedom in the midst of knowledge. Enoch's journeys are narrated with an attention to sensory detail that makes the strange familiar. He sees wheels within wheels, realms of sapphire, and a throne that is like a burning storm. Angels speak in tones that vibrate through bone and marrow, and the air is thick with a music that is not simply pleasant but authoritative. Those images do not simply dazzle, they teach the listener to understand hierarchy, order, and the weight of responsibility in the universe. The narrative uses beauty to demand reverence rather than to seduce pride. As Enoch moves through heaven, he is shown books and tablets, records not unrelated to the books of history and memory we carry on earth. These tablets contain the names of the righteous and the wicked, and their opening reveals the woven tapestry of causes and effects. The idea of divine record-keeping is not merely bureaucratic, it expresses a theology in which every action is significant and nothing passes without meaning. When Enoch reads these records or is allowed to glimpse them, the ordinary reader learns to perceive life as testimony, every gesture a sentence in a larger narrative. There is also a peculiar intimacy to some of Enoch's revelations, as if the divine allows him to look into private chambers where decisions are made. He hears deliberations in which mercy and justice argue like the tides, and he learns that the divine will is not a simple decree but a conversation with the world. That revelation challenges any notion of a cosmic tyrant. Instead, it shows a God who deliberates, who grieves, and who chooses pathways that balance consequence and compassion. Enoch's role as interlocutor reflects that balanced vision, a human voice inside a debate between the infinite and the fragile. One of the most striking aspects of the Watcher's story is how knowledge spreads like a contagion. An instruction given to one craftsman can become a craft that corrupts many. A cosmetic tip becomes a code for seduction that untethers social glue. The narrative method here is causal and cumulative. Small acts of instruction add up to systemic shifts that alter the ecology of society. The text does not simply say knowledge is bad, it insists that knowledge without covenant and contextual wisdom is destabilizing. And yet the texts also complicate the moral calculus by depicting some Watcher teachings as beneficial in themselves. Agricultural techniques and domestication of animals, for instance, could be seen as blessings that arise from instruction. The writers acknowledge this tension because history itself is messy. Tools can feed or kill, arts can console or corrupt. Enoch wrestles with that ambiguity, which keeps him from simplistic righteousness. His wisdom is a refusal to reduce every fallen thing to a single category. Enoch's office as mediator is not merely judicial, it is literary. He composes prayers, prophetic songs, and laments that aim to bring clarity to a world grown deaf to simple calls of conscience. The Book of Enoch itself reads like a hybrid of law, liturgy, and vision report. This hybrid form is fitting because the challenges it addresses are hybrid too, not merely legal transgression, but cosmic disorder that affects how a family wakes and how crops yield. Enoch's voice stitches together those domains into a morality that is cosmic in scale yet intimate in practice. The story invests heavily in cosmology because cosmology matters for ethics. If the heavens are ordered and have guardians, then human misdeeds resonate beyond the horizon. The celestial order and the human order are presented as interlaced. When one frays, the other creaks. That linkage serves as both warning and guide. The Watcher's Fall is a cautionary tale about the consequences of severing the connection between skill and wisdom, between knowledge and accountability. Enoch's visions also include vivid court scenes where intercession is an act of diplomacy. He stands before the divine throne advocating on behalf of a world he loves and pleading for reprieve for sinners who, in some accounts, are as much victims of attraction as perpetrators. The picture this creates is not of an indifferent deity but of one who is listening, who weighs pleas and whose decrees are shaped by the petitions of mortals. That theological posture gives human voices weight in the cosmic drama. The punishment described for the Watchers is complex, both precise and poetic. They are bound in places of jagged darkness until a day of judgment, their leaders separated and cast into deep pits. Yet the texts do not castigate them with simple mockery. Instead, they enumerate their crimes and implore remembrance that they had been glorious once. The paradox is unbearable, beings of light fallen into chains, which invites the listener to consider the fragility of virtues when misapplied. Enoch's own transformation is a climax of the narrative. He is not killed by heaven nor permanently bound. Instead, he is elevated in ways that blur the line between human and angel. Some traditions say he is translated, taken alive into heaven, his human body changed into a more luminous form. Others maintain he becomes a scribe archangel figure, a heavenly secretary entrusted with the administration of secrets. These variations reveal how the figure of Enoch functions across traditions, as intercessor, as teacher, as a figure who bridges domains. Different communities interpreted Enoch differently, weaving his story into their own theological fabrics. In Jewish tradition, his figure fascinated mystics who read his journeys as early maps of the divine realms. In Christian apocryphal lore, his visions were used to speak about Christ, angels, and future judgment. Later mystical currents, including aspects of Kabbalah and some Gnostic strains, reimagined Enoch as an exemplar of ascent and a symbol of the possibility of human transformation into divine intimacy. The story of the Watchers also became an influence on later literature and legend, in part because it addresses perennial human dilemmas. It asks what it means to receive instruction and what the moral requirements are when we possess transformative knowledge. It explores the temptation to take creative powers as licenses for dominance. In that sense, the narrative resonates far beyond its original milieu, entering questions about science and ethics, about the responsibilities of creators and the limits of curiosity. The image of angels teaching metallurgy and cosmetics is oddly modern in its resonance. It anticipates debates about technological progress and moral restraint. Are we better when we can do more, or worse if that capacity outstrips our ethical maturity? The Watcher's downfall offers a metaphor for contemporary anxieties. Knowledge without governance leads to imbalance. Enoch's counsel, in contrast, asks for temperance and for the cultivation of wisdom that keeps pace with skill. At root, Enoch's engagement with heaven is an argument for the primacy of relationship over possession. The Watchers sought possession of bodies, of knowledge, of influence. Enoch was shown a different path: relationship, petitioning, stewardship. This relational model reframes how we think about secrets. A secret in heaven is not merely information but a trust. When trust is betrayed, the disturbance ripples outward, and the narrative shows those ripples as tidal events that reshape human history. Enoch's texts also provide a strikingly detailed account of celestial mechanics as they were imagined then, an attempt to reconcile observation with narrative theology. The sun's rising and setting are described as duties performed by angelic guides, and stars keep counsel in vast assemblies. This personified cosmology gives audiences a way to feel the cosmos as a moral landscape where every movement is watched and charged with significance. The romantic quality of these descriptions is not primitive so much as explanatory. They provide a way to feel included in a universe that otherwise might seem indifferent. These stories make the heavens feel close and alive. Subscribe and let us know in the comments if you connect more with the angels carrying the sun or with the stars holding secret meetings. The moral seriousness of the Book of the Watchers is punctuated by the vivid depiction of human corruption. The text does not spare the reader. It relates scenes of violence, of greed, and of the degradation of social bonds. In such depictions, the giants are not merely monsters, they are metaphors for the way power distorts needs and desires. Enoch's visions, then, are pleas for a return to a world where power is subservient to care. Even as the story unfolds into cosmic panoramas, it remains centered on human bodies and relationships. Enoch cares for the generations that will waste under the weight of corruption. His laments are not esoteric but deeply tender. The narrative uses sorrow as a teacher, insisting that grief can be an instrument of conversion if it is allowed to shape the heart. There is a profoundly judicial element to the revelations Enoch receives. Heaven is shown as possessing both jurisprudence and compassion. The angels consult, the elders deliberate, and judgments are pronounced in words that sound like rivers of light. That juridical image reassures readers that disorder is not random and that justice, even when delayed, will be calibrated with precision. The story thus offers a kind of cosmic lawfulness that helps to reconcile human experience with a sense of ultimate meaning. The motif of the book or tablet recurs because memory matters, what is recorded is preserved, and preservation is a form of sanctification. Enoch is permitted to view and sometimes to write, and his textual activity is not incidental. In a world where the arts of writing and preservation were emerging, to attribute books to a figure like Enoch is to vindicate the ethical potential of record-keeping. The stories say that not all records are neutral, some books act as guardians of justice. This emphasis on recording might be one reason why Enoch becomes associated with eschatology, with the study of last things. The preserved secrets are like seeds planted in winter for a future harvest. Enoch's visions often pivot to images of final redemption and restoration, a world reordered where the arrogant are humbled and the faithful are crowned. That eschatological horizon gives the narrative its ultimate urgency. Revelation is not merely spectacle but a summons to transformation. Interestingly, the Book of Enoch and its themes were widely read and quoted in early centuries and then gradually sidelined from mainstream canons, though pockets of devotion remained. That marginalization did not erase Enoch's influence, rather, it allowed his image to mutate in diverse ways across cultures. For some, he was a saintly mystic who modeled intimate communion with God. For others, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing cosmic boundaries. Alongside textual tradition, iconography developed, portraying Enoch as a figure climbing stairways or writing in illuminated books, a visual shorthand for ascent and knowledge. Artists over centuries would draw him as the archetypal mystic, deep in conversation with angels or entranced by visions of stars. Those images reinforced his reputation as a bridge figure, someone who could cross between the known and the unknowable and return with messages that demanded transformation. The theme of crossing boundaries has always been compelling because it speaks to a human longing to exceed limitation without losing identity. Enoch embodies that longing but also exemplifies its proper constraints. He ascends, yes, but he does not seize authority. Instead, he returns with insight and plea. The narrative suggests that the higher the journey, the greater the obligation to serve what has been seen. The cosmic secrets he learns are not mere curiosities, they become resources for guidance. Enoch's calendar revelations, for example, were used by communities to fix feasts and fasts, to regulate agricultural cycles and ritual rhythms. These were practical applications of visionary insight, ways of making the heavens useful to human life while attempting to safeguard against arrogant exploitation. The very act of setting a calendar is an ethical act. It binds a community to a shared sense of time that shapes behavior. And yet, the texts are frank in admitting how easily such measures can be manipulated. Calendars can become instruments of power when they determine who keeps the fast and who owns the market. Astrology can be exploited to justify greed, and metallurgy can be turned into a tool of conquest. That admission keeps the narrative honest and urgent. Enoch's teaching is polemical not to smear knowledge itself, but to insist on the moral frameworks that must accompany it. One of the most affecting moments in Enoch's journey is his encounter with the grieving earth itself. He is shown the wounds inflicted by the giants, the rivers clogged with blood, the fields trampled into deserts. The scene brings the cosmic and the intimate together. Heaven seems remote until you see its decisions reflected in ruined farms and displaced families. Enoch's response is both liturgical and diplomatic. He weeps, he prays, and he pleads for remedies that will heal both land and people. The texts often emphasize the social consequences of the Watcher's teachings as well. Families are torn by sudden wealth and by the new hierarchies forged in metal and speech. The small communities that once relied on mutual aid become prey to monopolies of weaponry and knowledge. In this reading, the story is about the fragility of communal bonds when technical power concentrates in the hands of a few. Enoch's interventions thus have a social-political edge. He is not merely a cosmic scribe but a community advocate. This interplay of the cosmic and the civic gives the narrative a contemporary ring. It helps listeners feel that these ancient images speak to questions we face today. Who controls information? Who wields technology? How does power reshape intimate life? Enoch's model suggests that wisdom requires communal accountability. That is why his visions do not simply describe punishment, they sketch ways of reintroducing prudence and care into social structures. Enoch's portrayal as a mediator who neither condones nor utterly condemns offers a theology of complexity, a refusal of black and white moralism. He laments the Watchers and yet intercedes for them. He sees the necessity of the flood and yet mourns the loss of innocence that such a reset implies. This posture models a kind of spiritual maturity that holds paradox without retreating into cruelty or naivety. Listeners are often struck by the poetic cadences of the text. It shifts from lament to petition to description, as if Enoch is both composing music and writing an indictment. The rhetorical shifts are not accidental, they mirror the complexity of living under the weight of both knowledge and responsibility. In that sense, the narrative becomes pedagogical. It teaches how to feel rightly about power and how to respond when beauty becomes a peril. The story also insists upon the necessity of boundaries, sacred borders that preserve the integrity of creation. The Watchers violate a set of limits that are presented as life-preserving, and their breach results in systemic damage. Enoch's revelations underscore that boundaries are not arbitrary restrictions but guardians of mutual flourishing. To cross them casually is to invite catastrophe. In narrating heavenly secrets, the texts wrestle with the ethics of revelation itself. Who has the right to say what is heavenly? When should knowledge be shared, and when guarded? The dilemma is played out in the controversy over the Watchers. Some knowledge is liberating, some enslaving. The moral of the tale, implicit and sometimes explicit, is that revelation requires maturity and covenant. Enoch's own restraint in revealing what he has seen becomes a model of responsible disclosure. There is a striking pastoral tenderness in some passages where Enoch is shown scenes of future restoration, fields made fertile, cities refounded, and children raised without fear. These images are steeped in hope and help to balance depictions of violence and ruin. Even in judgment narratives there is an undercurrent of hope, the conviction that transformation is possible if communities reorient themselves around justice and care. The heavenly forms Enoch witnesses often have a geometry to them, as if spiritual realities are made intelligible through shapes and patterns. Thrones appear in concentric rings, lights align in measured arrays, and the movement of angels follows rhythms that could be notated. This penchant for geometric description is a way of translating ineffable experiences into perceivable structures. It gives readers something to grasp when words alone would founder. Another aspect that fascinates readers is the personalization of cosmic forces. Winds have names and offices, seasons are not anonymous. The personification of natural elements makes them accountable and relational. That narrative technique frames the world as a web of relationships in which each element bears responsibility, allowing moral language to be applied to phenomena we might otherwise leave in the realm of physical description. Some versions of Enoch's tale elaborate on the role of particular angels, giving them portfolios and personalities that mimic bureaucrats. Raphael tends to healing and care, Gabriel carries messages of judgment and revelation. Uriel often plays the role of light-bringer and guide. These characterizations create a kind of celestial governance that mirrors human governments but with an emphasis on stewardship rather than domination. They serve as models for different virtues and vices, making abstract qualities palpable. As the narrative progresses, it becomes clear that the knowledge withheld from humanity was less about hoarding power and more about preserving a pedagogical order. Orders in heaven are not arbitrary, they are calibrated to human capacity. The Watchers ignored that calibration, assuming that what could be shown could be wielded rightly. Enoch's counsel thus functions as an early ethic of prudence: do not give weapons to hearts that have not learned to love. The question of blame hovers in the background of these texts, and Enoch's position complicates it. While the Watchers bear responsibility, the human partners who accepted instruction also share it. This shared culpability suggests that evil is not only external imposition but internal willingness. The story thereby refuses to reduce moral failure to a single source. It is communal and distributed, and Enoch's intercession must therefore be both national and personal. There is a recurrent motif of light and its inverse, darkness, and the way Enoch moves between them is almost theatrical. Light is not merely illumination but presence, knowledge, and moral clarity. Darkness is not only hiding but also the condition of being cut off from counsel. Enoch's ascent is thus a movement toward not just information but relational light, an entrance into communion that transforms perception. That transformation, the texts imply, is the rarest of gifts. Some versions of Enoch's story expand on his role as a scribe, attributing to him detailed lists and astronomical tables that later communities used. Those who preserved Enoch's writings did so because they saw in his precision a remedy for chaos. To encode time and to align festivals was to protect a communal life from the erosions of arbitrary desire. The textual tradition, therefore, becomes a practical attempt to moralize the rhythms of daily life. The narrative also engages with questions of identity and role. Enoch straddles categories: human yet angelic, prophet yet scribe, mourner yet mediator. His hybrid identity is a narrative strategy that allows him to critique both angels and men without fully belonging to either camp. In this liminality lies his power. A liminal figure can see what insiders cannot and can speak into the gap between domains. There are scenes where Enoch is taught by angelic teachers who use metaphors from craft and from family life. They instruct him in things that are, at once, mechanical and intimate: how the stars are counted like the fingers of a hand, how the seasons move like the breathing of a household. This blending of the technical and the domestic is deliberate. The authors want readers to feel that cosmic order is not alien but like the structure of a home where people are fed, sheltered, and loved. One of the more unsettling images involves the binding of the giants and the eventual erasure of their memory from the memory rolls of humanity. The idea that entire kinds of beings can be struck from the ledger raises ethical questions about justice, mercy, and amnesia. Is obliteration a form of cleansing or a denial of history? The text does not supply an easy answer, but it leaves us with the sense that memory itself is an ethical responsibility. The stories about the Watchers also have a resonance with the archetype of the forbidden fruit, the notion that there are things meant to instruct only within covenant. The Watcher's sin is shaped like curiosity without guardianship, and the comparison to Eden is hard to avoid. The implication is that boundaries are less about withholding goodness and more about preserving the capacity to receive goodness without destruction. As audiences have engaged with Enoch through the centuries, the narrative has inspired reflections on pedagogy. How should profound knowledge be taught? The Watchers provide a negative pedagogy. They teach what they should not, to pupils who cannot yet integrate the learning. Enoch, conversely, models a pedagogy that includes moral formation. Learning, the narrative asserts, is not merely absorption but character formation. These texts also explore the psychology of retribution, not just as punishment but as restoration. The binding of the watchers, the cleansing of the earth, and the subsequent recreation all function as attempts to restore balance. The writers insist that divine action, even when severe, aims at eventual reconciliation. That conviction provides hope within the darker arcs of the story. Enoch's intercessionary prayer life becomes a template for spiritual activism. He does not withdraw from a troubled world to preserve his purity. Instead, he plunges into the fray with petitions and pleas that carry both urgency and restraint. Prayer, in this context, is not passive but active, an advocacy that seeks to transform decisions rather than simply to plead for comfort. There is a strong sense of destiny threaded through the narrative, the notion that certain outcomes are both inevitable and contingent. Events like the flood are presented as necessary responses to particular accumulations of corruption, yet at the same time, the text emphasizes that human choices shape those outcomes. This tension between fate and freedom is central to the moral gravity of Enoch's visions. Enoch's attachment to children and to future generations is another recurrent note. He often speaks as one who cares deeply for those who have not yet been born, offering warnings and instructions meant to preserve the innocent. That future-oriented perspective infuses the story with a responsibility ethic that feels modern: protect the capacity of the future to flourish, even at present cost. The symbolic repertoire of Enoch is impressively broad. Trees, waters, mountains, and stars all function as metaphors for spiritual truths. Mountains house secrets and rivers carry judgment. Trees can be both shelter and test. The narrative's reliance on natural imagery makes its teachings visceral rather than abstract, allowing listeners to feel the stakes. At the core of the narrative is a theological claim about embodiment, that the body matters, that material reality is not a prison for the soul but the theater of moral action. The Watcher's sin includes sexual transgression, and the effects are not merely spiritual but bodily and social. Enoch's reaction underscores that physical actions have spiritual consequences, a view that refuses to split matter and meaning. Enoch's ascension into heaven is not a triumphant exaltation alone, it is also a surrender of certain human comforts. The images used to describe his translation, garments of light, the softening of bones, suggest not only elevation but also transformation. This dual sense of gain and sacrifice gives Enoch's story an existential depth. To ascend is to exchange some aspects of contained humanness for the ability to serve more widely. The figure of Enoch also feeds into apocalyptic imaginations, the detailed pictures of end times that would captivate later communities. His authority as a witness to heavenly secrets makes him a natural voice for eschatological speculation. That speculative thread spins long and wide, coloring how different traditions imagine final justice and restoration. In some interpretations, Enoch becomes a prototype for the wise man who sees both the suffering in the world and its healing. He is not distant from human tears, rather, he is shaped by them. That pastoral quality keeps his narrative from becoming merely doctrinal, it roots it in compassion. The narrative encourages listeners to consider the use of language itself. Enoch's visions are couched in metaphors and images because the human mind cannot hold the infinite in literal descriptions. The text thereby honors mystery, it uses language to gesture toward reality without exhausting it. That rhetorical humility models a spiritual approach that balances curiosity with reverence. As we move through the story, we encounter an insistence that justice involves restoration more than retaliation. The flood is severe, but subsequent visions promise renewal, new covenants, and renewed capacity for trust. That arc offers a theology in which punishment serves a restorative telos, not mere eradication. The idea of stewardship is woven into every fabric of the story. Enoch is shown that human dominion is meant to be caretaking, not domination. The Watchers exemplify the inversion of that idea, illustrating how power, when misapplied, generates ruin. Enoch's counsel then becomes an ethic of stewardship, an argument for the sacred use of resources and knowledge. There is also an aesthetic dimension to Enoch's revelations. Beauty itself is ethical. The celestial chambers he visits are beautiful, and their beauty is connected to order and goodness. When beauty is misappropriated, as by the Watcher's teachings in cosmetics and ornament, it ceases to point beyond itself and becomes a trap. Thus, aesthetics in the narrative become moral signposts. Enoch's narrative is dense with paradox. Knowledge as blessing and curse, proximity to God as test, revelation as responsibility. These paradoxes resist neat conclusions, which may be why the texts have remained compelling for millennia. They invite listeners into a complex moral universe where simple answers do not suffice. In some later communities, Enoch is associated with heavenly hierarchy in even more literal ways, sometimes conflated with angelic figures of high rank. The figure of Metatron in certain strands of Jewish mysticism demonstrates this tendency, a human elevated to an angelic scribe and counselor. Such developments show how Enoch's figure could be read as a prototype for the possibility of human participation in divine administration. The tale also has an instructive view of repentance. The punishment of the Watchers is absolute in some senses, but there are hints of lament and longing among them. That portrayal complicates any simplistic reading that demonizes completely. The texts allow for sorrow to be a step toward transformation, even if the ultimate consequences are severe. This tension keeps the narrative alive as both caution and hope. Echoes of Enoch reverberate in many religious and literary traditions because his story addresses universal longings for knowledge, for communion, for rescue from the ravages of power. Those themes are perennial and thus endlessly retold. The mythic quality of Enoch's journey lets listeners place their own lives within a larger framework and perhaps reassess the uses and costs of their own pursuits. The figure of the Watchers has been a mirror for each generation that reads them. Where one era sees technology, another sees political power, yet another sees sexual license. Each reading is an interpretation of the central moral crisis, what happens when beings who ought to watch instead seize and exploit. Enoch's role as witness and mediator resists that seizure by offering a different kind of influence, wisdom tempered by care. You can hear, in the cadence of the stories, an appeal not to fear knowledge but to practice a disciplined receptivity. Accept the light you are given, the writers urge, but do not become its master. That posture is not a rejection of progress but a plea for ethical formation to accompany progress. Enoch's example suggests that the ability to ascend demands the willingness to anchor what is learned in care. The images of binding and unbinding are repeated because they are central metaphors for moral order. Chains are not simply punitive artifacts, they also serve as metaphors for consequences, as ways of indicating that some freedoms come at the cost of communal harm. When Enoch sees the bindings placed upon the Watchers, he understands that some liberties, when misapplied, must be limited for the good of all. That is a difficult teaching but one that the narrative insists upon with tenderness. Enoch's appeal to future generations is perhaps the most enduring part of his story. He warns not only about what to avoid but also about how to cultivate communities that resist the seductions that toppled his age. He advocates for systems of mutual accountability, for horologies of time that anchor life, and for a spiritual formation to guard against misuse. Those are surprisingly pragmatic proposals wrapped in visionary language. The narrative also explores the psychology of temptation in intimate detail. The Watchers experience desire that begins with admiration but morphs into possession. Their story maps the progression from wonder to appropriation. Enoch's mediations attempt to restore admiration without objectification, a theme that remains relevant wherever fascination risks becoming ownership. Ultimately, the figure of Enoch challenges listeners to reflect on the kind of wisdom they seek. Does wisdom become a means to control and dominate, or is it a pathway to compassion and stewardship? The story's answer is clear in its persistence. Wisdom divorced from moral formation becomes a poison, while wisdom joined to humility becomes a healing balm. Enoch's journey thus stands as an invitation to seek gifts that enlarge the heart rather than inflate the ego. Throughout the centuries, Enoch's tale has inspired liturgies, commentaries, and artistic renderings that transformed its edges and emphasized different aspects. Some communities highlighted his asceticism, others his prophetic clarity, and still others his administrative role. That multiplicity of emphases shows the adaptability of the figure. He can be a mystic, a pastor, a judge, or a scribe depending on what a community most needs to hear. The Watchers remain a potent symbol because they personify a universal human drama, the misuse of gifts. They ask us to consider the moral cost of our abilities. Enoch, as one who walked with God, shows another path, the disciplined reception of gifts and the steady practice of care. That countervailing example became a spiritual resource precisely because it was not flinty or rigid but supple, wise, and tender. Enoch's narrative invites us to listen, to weigh, and to act. It does not absolve the listener from responsibility, rather it summons the audience into participation. The story acts like a mirror, reflecting contemporary concerns about technology, governance, and intimacy back into ancient images. In that reflective movement, both the past and the present become teachers. The cosmic imagery and the human pathos are blended in a way that keeps the ear attuned. There is grandeur without flippancy, and sorrow without despair. The narrative invites a reflective posture, a readiness to move from simply being informed to being transformed. Enoch's example asks us to accept knowledge as a call rather than a conquest. As the story circles back to its opening notes, we find that walking with God is not a passive privilege but an active calling. Enoch walks, yes, but his walking is a practice, attentive, petitionary, lucid. The phrase invites us to consider what it might mean to walk with whatever capacities we possess, with a humility that allows us to learn and to be bound by love. Finally, the tale of Enoch and the Watchers leaves an enduring ethical challenge, to hold knowledge and practice in a tethered embrace. The narrative shows the disasters of unmoored discovery and the possibilities of wisdom-shaped skill. Enoch's life, with its upward paths, lamentations, and pleas, serves not just as an ancient curiosity but as a living lesson that secrets of heaven, when met with humility, can become instruments of blessing rather than instruments of ruin. There was a time when the world listened for footsteps and heard instead a whisper that seemed to come from another realm, a voice that little by little shaped the way people imagined heaven, judgment, and the light that follows truth. That voice, as many ancient fragments insist, belonged to a man named Enoch, a figure who walked with God and lived as if the distance between earth and the divine could be crossed like the length of a breath. He is a man who steps quietly into the margins of sacred history and suddenly fills the margins with visions, names, and warnings, as if someone handed him a lamp and asked him to walk ahead of the crowd. To follow his path is to notice how intimately the promise of light is tied to the demand for justice, and how every revelation pulses with consequence. Enoch's story arrives to us not as a tidy narrative but as a collection of visions, prophecies, and images that bloom across centuries, languages, and cultures. Portions of these words were preserved in surprising places, in ancient Aramaic fragments, in Greek quotations, and a living Ethiopian tradition that kept an entire book of Enoch safe as scripture. These manifold witnesses present Enoch as a seer of boundaries, boundaries between heaven and earth, between sin and order, between the ephemeral lives of men and the enduring laws of cosmic justice. He is a bridge figure, a man whose feet remain on earth while his mind and eyes travel among stars and angels. If you listen closely to what the Book of Enoch offers, you hear first the theme of judgment, not as a distant verdict delivered in cold finality, but as a corrective force aimed at restoring a fractured creation. The prophecies speak of angels who abandoned their posts and of giants born from illicit unions, of violence spreading across the earth until the very sky seems to tremble. Such images are vivid because Enoch's primary conversation is with disorder, wherever the created order has been violated by cruelty, exploitation, or cosmic betrayal. Enoch's visions announce that a reckoning will come. Yet the book dresses this reckoning in light, and not merely as destruction, but as purging and reformation, like a fire that reveals gold beneath dross. In the opening visions, Enoch is given a tour of the heavens, though the tour is not a cosmological lecture, it is a moral geography. He is shown the places where the heavenly bodies keep their appointed paths and the vaults that separate the waters above from the waters below. Each part of the firmament is associated with laws and watchings. The planets are not indifferent objects but keepers of time and testimony, witnesses to human behavior. When the heavenly order is violated, when angels overstep or people succumb to violence, the cosmos itself reacts, and Enoch becomes the voice chosen to translate those reactions into human understanding. Central to Enoch's prophecy is the figure of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and took wives among human women, producing offspring called giants. The story reads like a myth of hubris, divine beings entering human space without humility, assuming they can possess and model human life while escaping human responsibility. The violent giants escalate all manner of chaos, they feed on the creations of men, they abuse their advantage, and they teach forbidden knowledge that upends human societies. Enoch observes these events as an indictment of misuse of power, and his warnings about judgment focus on the consequences of mixing realms that were never meant to be mixed. But Enoch does not merely narrate catastrophe, he communicates the mechanisms of correction. The prophecies detail how the cosmic court convenes, how the angels who preside report the transgressions, and how decrees are issued to bind the transgressors until the appointed end. There is an almost legal precision to the language. Names are recorded, charges are catalogued, and sentences are set in motion by the voice of the Ancient of Days. Yet even here the tone is not solely punitive. Judgment in Enoch's world aims at rebalancing creation and ensuring that light, truth, and rightful order will be restored to their dominion. As Enoch walks through his visions, he learns that the pathway of light requires witness and testimony. In one scene, he ascends and sees books piled with the names of the righteous and the deeds of the wicked. The righteous are written in a book of life, the wicked in the records of condemnation. This notion of writing, of keeping account, emphasizes that history is not anonymous in Enoch's vision. Every act writes itself into the ledger of heaven, and what seems hidden in human darkness may be illuminated at the appointed hour. Such a doctrine comforts the oppressed with the promise that injustice does not disappear unnoticed, and it unnerves the powerful by suggesting that their deeds, whether masked or public, are being preserved and will be evaluated. Enoch's prophetic voice is also paradoxically intimate. He who walks with God does not deliver pronouncements from a remote throne but speaks as an interlocutor, pleading for mercy and asking for wisdom to understand the mysteries he has shown. This intimacy emerges when Enoch intercedes on behalf of the fallen, when he questions the reasons for divine anger, and when he seeks to reconcile the terrible images he witnesses with the righteousness he knows God to embody. His role, then, is partly that of interpreter and partly that of intercessor. The visions compel him into a ministry of speech, and his words are designed to awaken human hearts to their responsibilities. The Book of Enoch is porous to other motifs of ancient thought, such as the theme of light as knowledge and the motif of a chosen remnant that survives judgment. When the prophet speaks of light, he means an illumination that transforms sight into insight, that reveals the pattern beneath disorder. This light is moral and cosmological. It dispels the fog of ignorance and self-deception that allows injustices to fester. It also casts a clarifying glare on destiny, showing that human time participates in a larger chronology in which the end is neither capricious nor avoidable but shaped by choices and by a divine plan. For listeners who know the larger sweep of biblical imagination, Enoch's ideas resonate like an amplified echo. His apocalyptic imagery, thrones, heavenly courts, angelic warriors, and cosmic upheaval later surfaces in the New Testament and in rabbinic commentaries, shaping how subsequent generations imagined the end of days. Yet Enoch's voice remains distinct. He blends solemn judgment with visionary beauty, stern warnings with luminous promises, and legal procedure with poetic cosmology. This combination gives his prophecies a double edge. They terrify and console, they instruct and inspire. Throughout the text, time itself is a character. Enoch is shown cycles and eras, the appointed seasons in which events will unfold, and the difference between immediate punishment and ultimate restoration. He learns that some processes of judgment are swift and visible, while others are gradual, working through generations like a slow-burning furnace. The prophecies insist that human beings live within these cycles and that the moral choices of one age can reverberate for centuries. For those who hear Enoch, the past is never merely an archive, it is also a predictor of patterns likely to reemerge unless redirection occurs. As the narrative expands, Enoch receives names of many celestial beings, descriptions of their functions, and accounts of their transgressions. These sections can seem like catalogs, but they are meant to train the reader or listener to discern true authority from counterfeit power. The fallen angels are not depicted as wholly alien, rather, they are corrupted versions of roles that should have bolstered justice. By naming them in their misdeeds, Enoch strips their mystique and exposes the moral logic behind their punishment. This demystification is a crucial part of his teaching. To see clearly is to be equipped to resist. Enoch's vision of the cosmic courtroom is especially striking because it attributes to God a careful administration of justice, like a judge weighing evidence with infinite patience. There are witnesses gathered from every realm, statements recorded, and decrees that account for both the scale of the crime and the possibility of repentance. Even when judgment is stern, there is a sense that it follows law rather than arbitrary wrath. Such an image reassures those who fear capricious divine violence, for Enoch's God is righteous and measured, intending not to destroy but to heal by removing the cancer of corruption. In the midst of these heavy themes, Enoch's prophecies also contain moments of tenderness. He sees the righteous souls, those who have turned from violence and sought mercy, and hears that their reward is not mere escape from punishment but participation in light. Their future is described not simply as immunity but as intimacy with the divine presence, a sharing in knowledge and an elevation of being. This tenderness gives the threat of judgment a contour that many find surprisingly compassionate. Punishment is not the endpoint but the doorway to a restored relationship between creation and creator. The motif of hidden knowledge appears repeatedly, and Enoch is both recipient and guardian of this lore. He learns of the secrets of the stars, of the trajectories of the heavenly bodies, and of the order that keeps time moving in measured steps. But knowledge in Enoch's world is never neutral, it is ethically charged. When forbidden knowledge fell into the hands of the Watchers, or when it was used to corrupt, it led to devastation. Conversely, the true secrets revealed to Enoch are meant to direct humanity toward humility and stewardship, insisting that wisdom must accompany power if it is to be life-giving. As Enoch journeys through heavens and sees things no mortal eye ordinarily beholds, his language becomes more symbolic and poetic, and yet the message remains practical. He speaks in images because images can bypass argument and strike the heart. A vision of a vast abyss, a blazing throne, a river of fire, these are not mere theatrics but lessons shaped to awaken the listener to moral realities. The sensory force of his visions is designed to move someone who has grown complacent, to make them feel the vertigo of cosmic imbalance and the urgency of reformation. Even the descriptions of celestial geography serve a purpose beyond wonder. Mountains of judgment, treasuries of snow, chambers of light, each element in Enoch's cosmology functions as a metaphor for moral order. The mountains that hold the stars are often the very places where justice is administered or where secrets are stored. The treasuries keep both blessings and sanctions in reserve. This blending of physical place and moral function helps the listener imagine the stakes. Cosmic order is not abstract, and violations have tangible locations and consequences. The Book of Enoch also contains what might feel like proposals for ritual or communal behavior, though it never prescribes a rigid liturgy. Instead, it offers a spiritual posture, wakefulness, watchfulness, and ethical attentiveness. Enoch insists that those who would remain part of the covenant community must be alert to the signs of corruption and committed to resisting the trends that lead to degradation. This posture is both active and contemplative, involving engagement with the world and a disciplined life of prayer and reflection. A striking feature is Enoch's attention to the future of the righteous and the destiny of the wicked. He describes the separation, not merely of bodies but of destinies, where light and darkness part company until the final reconciliation. The righteous are envisioned as receiving crowns, being given seats near the divine presence, and sharing in the restoration of the earth. The wicked, by contrast, face confinement and eventual destruction, their agency removed to prevent further harm. The dramatic clarity of these futures underlines the moral seriousness of living in a world where choices matter cosmically. The prophetic voice sometimes turns toward lament, and Enoch records sorrows that arise when communities fail to heed warnings. There is grief for lost innocence, for children born into chaos, and for cultures undone by greed and violence. This grief is not indulgent moping, it is a form of moral acuity that recognizes the depth of corruption and the difficulty of repair. Enoch's lament invites empathy and outrage in equal measure, spurring listeners to care enough to act. Enoch's portrayal of the cosmic agents is nuanced and, at times, surprising. Angels appear as administrators and agents of corrective action rather than as mere messengers of bliss. Some angels are stern and exacting, handing out sentences, while others are gentle guardians who protect the righteous and teach them secrets necessary for survival. The diversity of heavenly characters resists the flattening of spiritual beings into a single stereotype. Instead, it suggests a divine bureaucracy that is responsive, disciplined, and morally sensitive. A recurring concern is the misuse of secret knowledge. Enoch is alarmed when technology, craft, and forbidden arts are taught without ethical restraint, for he sees that what could elevate human life becomes destructive when divorced from wisdom. The arts of metalwork, cosmetics, and enchantments, in his account, become tools of domination when taught by those who refuse moral limits. This warning predates modern debates about the ethical use of technology, yet it resonates powerfully. Knowledge without conscience is a recipe for catastrophe. The prophecies also meditate on cosmic suffering in a way that opens space for empathy even toward the fallen. Enoch does not always demystify the fallen angels. Sometimes he asks why such beings would transgress, probing motives and vulnerabilities. This compassionate curiosity does not excuse wrongdoing, but it reminds listeners that transgression has roots and that understanding those roots can assist in restoration. Enoch's method, therefore, mixes judgment with a desire to comprehend, as if healing requires both firmness and diagnostic compassion. As the visions proceed, Enoch is shown the ultimate destiny of creation, where things that once were obscured are drawn into the light. In that final scene, darkness has been banished and the cosmos itself seems to sing. The material world is not discarded but renewed, transformed by a process that respects continuity while overturning corruption. That image comforts those who fear nihilistic endings. Enoch's ending is teleological, meaning it points toward purpose and fulfillment rather than randomness. There is a pastoral dimension too, where the Book of Enoch imagines a future shepherding that tends to the moral welfare of the people. The righteous are often pictured as a flock cared for by divine shepherds, protected from wolves and guided into green pastures. This image tempers the stern judicial language and helps listeners understand that justice includes care. The shepherding metaphor reassures communities that the ultimate aim of correction is not to humiliate but to cultivate and sustain life. Enoch's prophecies also engage with the problem of silence. Why does the divine sometimes appear hidden when injustice persists? The book suggests that silence is not absence but a strategic waiting, a time in which human beings are given latitude to choose and to develop. This interval is controversial and painful because it allows evil to continue. Yet Enoch frames it as part of a larger pedagogy. Time tests character, and the delay harnesses free will to demonstrate who will align with light. Another theme that emerges is hope as a theological principle rather than mere optimism. Hope in Enoch is a confident expectation that the divine plan will be fulfilled and that the righteous will not be abandoned. This hope is nourished by visions of light and by the unfolding narrative where transgression is exposed and corrected. It moves listeners from passive waiting to active preparation, for hope demands a people willing to embody the virtues it anticipates. Literary scholars note how richly Enoch's language uses metaphors of light and darkness, and when you listen, those metaphors begin to feel seismic. Light is knowledge, presence, and the affirmation of truth. Darkness connotes ignorance, secrecy, and the will to dominate. The repeated interplay between these two poles creates a moral drama in which human choices constantly decide which way the world will tilt. Enoch's rhetorical insistence on illumination is not merely poetic, it functions as an ethical program demanding transparency and accountability. For those who have wrestled with questions about justice beyond human courts, Enoch offers a vision in which cosmic justice is painstaking and inevitable. It is not a deus ex machina that suddenly removes free will, rather, it is a system that respects moral causality. Actions produce consequences, names are recorded, and both heaven and earth witness to the moral trajectory of persons and peoples. To modern listeners, this might seem severe, yet it also supplies a corrective to moral relativism by insisting that the moral arc has shape and direction. Enoch's speeches often carry the voice of urgency, and he addresses kings and crowds with the same intensity, as if no one is exempt from the summons to change. He warns rulers of their responsibility because power magnifies impact, unjust policies become systemic wrongs, and leaders who indulge corruption unleash wide harm. For communities, Enoch urges vigilance and repentance, for collective sin can become a contagion if left unchecked. This communal dimension of judgment insists that morality is not merely personal but structurally generative. Doctrinally, the Book of Enoch challenges simplistic divisions between fate and freedom. It portrays a universe where God ordains certain outcomes but also where human choice matters profoundly. The prophecy that certain transgressors are bound until a final day does not negate the space of moral transformation in the present. Instead, it situates present choices within a cosmological context that both constrains and empowers human agency. Listening to Enoch, then, is to accept that destiny and responsibility cohabit the same story. At times, Enoch's language becomes elegiac, mourning the loss of early intimacy between heaven and earth. He imagines a time when the divine presence walked among people, when the invisible was familiar, and when boundaries between realms were honored. The rupture caused by the Watchers and the subsequent moral collapse is described as a theft. Something precious was stolen from humanity and must be reclaimed. This motif of recovery strengthens the book's undercurrent of restoration. The end is not destruction but reclamation. The Book of Enoch has a social critique woven through it that remains relevant centuries later. It admonishes those who use knowledge for oppression, encourages leaders to rule with justice, and calls communities to protect the vulnerable. In describing the fate of the wrongdoers, Enoch targets those who abuse their positions to exploit others, making his prophecies as much about the structures of society as about individual sin. This social dimension has made Enoch congenial to readers seeking a prophetic voice that speaks against corruption and structural violence. Musically, the rhythm of Enoch's prose feels like a lamentation alternated with triumphal announcements, and the sound of it shapes the listener's response. The sections of mourning invite repentance, the proclamations of victory awaken courage. This alternation prevents the text from being relentlessly doom-laden and instead allows a moral cadence in which sorrow leads to correction and then to consolation. Hearing Enoch is thus a participatory experience. The listener moves through fear into reaffirmed hope. One cannot discuss Enoch without mentioning the figure called the Son of Man, a title that in his prophecies points to an exalted, eschatological figure who will judge and restore. This figure is described with luminous attributes, sometimes as a pre-existent angelic being, at other times as an agent who emerges in the last days to vindicate the righteous. The ambiguity of the Son of Man image has fascinated readers for millennia because it bridges human and divine functions, standing as a symbol of both representative humanity and transcendent authority. Enoch's treatment of eschatology, the study of last things, tends toward a moralized teleology. The end is not merely an endpoint but the culmination of ethical patterns sown across generations. The final judgment is pictured as the decisive correction of long-standing disorders, and the renewed creation is envisioned as a place where justice is not an imposition but a rhythm of life. This teleology imbues human action with meaning because choices participate in shaping the planetary finale. Another striking element is Enoch's trust in divine transparency. He insists that the hidden will be disclosed and that the veil over secret deeds will be lifted. This emphasis on revelation is less about gratuitous exposure and more about establishing a world where truth governs relationships. For people living under secrecy and exploitation, the promise that darkness will be unmasked is a profound comfort, suggesting that moral restoration requires truth-telling and accountability. While Enoch's prophetic repertoire includes visions of epic scale, the text also attends to everyday pieties. There are instructions for prayer, admonitions to avoid arrogance, and encouragements to maintain humility and prosperity. These practical notes reveal that eschatology in Enoch's vision is not only spectacular but ethical. The final things must be prepared for by ordinary virtues cultivated in daily life. Thus Enoch blends the extraordinary with the mundane in service of moral formation. Enoch's legacy is complex because the book circulated in many communities and was sometimes embraced and sometimes treated with suspicion. Early Christian writers quoted him with admiration when his ideas harmonized with their convictions, while other authorities hesitated because parts of his cosmology seemed to deviate from emerging orthodoxy. In some traditions, though, Enoch remained authoritative and cherished as scripture, particularly in Ethiopian Christianity, where his book was incorporated into the biblical corpus. The varied reception history reveals how potent and provocative his prophecies have been. Despite contested canonical status, Enoch's influence is undeniable. Phrases and images associated with his prophecies echo through later literature and theology, shaping how people imagined angels, judgment, and the end of the age. Surely his vivid depiction of the heavenly court and the Son of Man provided scriptural scaffolding for subsequent apocalyptic writings. Even when his precise claims were debated, the moral gravity of his visions continued to challenge readers to confront the dynamics of power and the demands of justice. A significant strength of Enoch's prophecies is their insistence on moral imagination. He compels listeners to imagine not only punitive outcomes but restorative possibilities, cities rebuilt, violence ended, knowledge redirected to good. His language invites people to picture futures that honor creation and affirm human dignity. In doing so, he provides a hopeful counterweight to narratives that assume collapse is inevitable and instead insists that transformation is within the realm of divine and human cooperation. The Book of Enoch also explores the ethics of prophecy itself. Enoch often wonders how to communicate what he sees, how to translate the ineffable into words that people can hear and obey. He worries that his message will be misunderstood or rejected, and at times he pleads for his contemporaries to take heed. These metaprophetic reflections remind us that prophecy demands courage and fidelity. It requires one to speak difficult truths and to persist in calling a people back to right paths. As the narrative unfolds, Enoch becomes less a solitary visionary and more a founder of a moral community. His instructions bind together those who will carry the light into future generations, establishing a lineage of witness that outlasts his earthly tenure. This communal aspect transforms prophecy into pedagogy. The visions are not merely revelations but resources for forming a people who will live under the statutes of justice. In this light, Enoch's legacy is not only doctrinal but institutional, affecting how communities reconstruct their moral identities. The prophetic work often employs shock to awaken listeners, and Enoch is not shy about using terrifying images to shake the complacent. The grotesque depiction of roaming giants, the pyres of punishment, and the dissolution of wicked empires are designed to jar hearts back to attention. Yet alongside the shock, there is consistently an invitation to change course, to choose the path that aligns with light. Enoch's strategy is thus both warning and invitation, punishment and enticement toward moral restoration. Enoch's writings also have a distinctive sense of narrative arc. He does not rely on rhetoric alone. He crafts a story with movement, tension, and resolution. The arc begins with revelation, moves through crisis, depicts a cosmic adjudication, and concludes with the promise of renewal. This structure helps listeners follow the logic of divine justice. The world does not drift aimlessly into chaos but is guided through corrective processes toward a redeemed reality. The storytelling element makes Enoch's message more memorable and more ethically compelling. In his final visions, the emphasis shifts toward consummation and fulfillment, and the language becomes suffused with the assurance that light will prevail. Enoch sees the righteous entering a place of safety, sees the wicked confined, and watches as creation itself is refreshed. The vision does not eliminate the scars of history, but it promises that suffering will be acknowledged and that justice will be satisfied in a way that honors the victims. This reassurance undergirds the whole prophetic work. The end makes sense of the moral turbulence of the present. Listening to Enoch today, many people find resonance in his concern for the vulnerable and his insistence that power be accountable. His prophetic imagination does not only fret about abstract metaphysics, it confronts the concrete harms inflicted by those who would dominate. Whether the abuses are sexual, economic, or political, Enoch's condemnation of exploitation invites modern readers to examine their own systems and to realign them toward justice. The prophetic call thus remains urgent across time. Where light is dim, it must be rekindled. At moments, the book invites philosophical reflection on the nature of evil. Is evil simply the absence of good, as some philosophers suggest, or is it a positive force with its own logic? Enoch complicates such debates by portraying evil as a willful transgression that corrupts roles and relationships. The Watcher's sin is not cosmetic but ontological. By perverting their assigned function, they altered the structure of creation. Thus, Enoch proposes that evil is both moral deviation and structural distortion, a diagnosis that requires remedies on both individual and communal levels. The images of light in Enoch also hint at epistemological concerns. How do we know God, and how does knowledge shape our moral lives? Revelation in Enoch is not merely a deposit of facts, but an initiation into a way of seeing the world. To walk with God is to undergo a transformation of perception, to learn to read signs, and to act in accordance with a larger wisdom. This initiation makes Enoch a teacher as much as a prophet, guiding those who follow him into the habits that sustain life under the sun and within the vaults of heaven. Enoch's prophetic voice is pulsing with urgency, but it is also attuned to the slow work of character formation. The book encourages patience in moral endeavors, reminding listeners that cultivating virtue often unfolds across seasons and even generations. This patience does not excuse moral laziness but disposes people to sustained efforts toward justice. The combination of immediacy and long-term vision is one of the book's most practical gifts. It teaches how to live faithfully in both crisis and calm. A persistent question in Enoch concerns the fate of the natural world and whether the created order itself suffers punishment. The prophecies reveal a cosmos sensitive to human sin, ecological disorder, and cosmic disturbances are linked to moral failure. Yet the aim is not to annihilate nature but to restore it. The renewal promised is a healed earth where the cycles of life and fertility resume their rightful work. This ecological note renders Enoch surprisingly modern, as if he were speaking into a future when humanity would recognize its responsibility to the planet. Enoch's prophetic style is also pedagogical. He employs parables, symbolic actions, and dramatic scenes to instruct. These forms teach more powerfully than abstract exhortation because they engage imagination and habit. Listeners who hear these parables are prompted to embody their lessons, to let the narrative shape how they live and make decisions. Prophecy here becomes a means of moral formation, an audible discipline that molds communities through story and vision. There is a profound social theology embedded in Enoch's work. Societies are not behaved by chance but shaped by moral laws that reflect divine intention. When a community embraces justice, structures flourish. When it succumbs to exploitation, structures decay. Enoch's prophecies thus function like a mirror held up to societies, revealing the consequences of moral choices on civic life. This social lens has made Enoch a touchstone for reformers and critics looking for spiritual foundations for political renewal. While some have misused Enoch's vivid imagery for sensational ends, a careful listening recovers its deeper ethical core. The giants and watchers, the heavenly books, and the courts of judgment are not mere curiosities to be exploited for drama. They are metaphors designed to teach moral seriousness. To attend to Enoch's voice is to take up a discipline of conscience, to allow images of cosmic order to inform one's commitments in the mundane world. The drama, then, is meant to be transformative, not merely titillating. In conclusion, though Enoch never authored a neat manual of doctrine, his compendium of visions and prophecies forms a rich tapestry connecting judgment and light. He shows that justice and mercy are not opposed but interwoven, that revelation calls people to change, and that the cosmos itself participates in moral adjudication. For listeners, the Book of Enoch offers both warning and consolation, a call to accountability and a promise that light will ultimately prevail. To walk with Enoch is to be invited into a long, attentive journey where every choice matters and where the destiny of the world hangs in the balance between darkness and the returning dawn. There was a time before towers and great cities stretched their arms toward the sky, when names were short and stories were measured by hearth fires and journeys on unpaved paths. In that quieter world, where the nights were deep and the days moved at the pace of walking, a man named Enoch took his steps. His life was a rhythm of rising with the sun, tending to whatever work he had been given, and listening for the small intimations of presence that came like wind through reeds. The world he knew felt close and fragile, and yet he walked with a sense that it was held by something vast and unseen. He belonged to a lineage that counted years in long chains and claimed the dignity of memory. People around him spoke of fathers and grandfathers, of years that stretched almost as far as the imagination could reach. Enoch listened to those stories and let them sit quietly within him, not as mere genealogy but as the hum of continuity between what was and what might be. This continuity made him attentive. It taught him to carry his own days as a bridge between what had been given and what could be offered. Walking with God became less of a metaphor and more of a steady fact in his life. It did not always arrive in visions or thunder. Often it was the small confirmations that a path was right or a person needed help. He learned to hear the world in the way the ancients did, with ears tuned to moral inflection and a heart that felt the weight of covenant. To walk with God for Enoch meant to be present in ordinary acts and to accept that presence as sacred. He was not a loud prophet who came to demand attention. His presence was quieter, like a bell heard through fog. People noticed his steadiness before they understood anything else, how he spoke to neighbors, shared food with children, and walked through disputes with a coolness that carried firm compassion. This steadiness invited trust, and trust invites story. Before long, stories gathered around him like birds on a roof, each carrying a feather of something greater. Those who watched him grew curious about the possibility that devotion could be lived as a daily posture, not merely a dramatic event. Enoch's example suggested that sanctity was not confined to temples or altars but could be embodied in the simple continuous act of living without bitterness and with attentiveness. In markets and fields, people began to test gentleness against urgency and to watch whether integrity cost anything. The result was small transformations, hands that were steadier in labor, words offered with less haste, an atmosphere of mutual care that spread through the neighborhood like slow light. Yet the life he led was not easy. To walk with God meant that Enoch saw things others chose to ignore. He noticed injustice where others accepted the way of the world. He saw grief that people tried to bury beneath laughter, and he felt the spiritual drift of a community tempted by convenience. His attention sometimes brought him into conflict, and other times into loneliness. Those were the hours when his walk required not only fidelity but courage. In the course of those years, stories of a strange intimacy between Enoch and the divine multiplied. They spoke of nights when he did not sleep but sat as if listening to a conversation, and mornings when he returned from lone walks changed as if the air itself had altered him. People who had known him for decades admitted to a slow recognition that his face carried an inner light that did not come from mirrors. Curiosity turned to reverence for some, and suspicion for others, as is natural with anything that disrupts ordinary certainties. The notion of walking with God is layered. It includes obedience, but it is not reducible to it. For Enoch, obedience was a pathway, an orientation of life toward a divine standard, but it was also informed by affection. He loved what he walked toward. That love informed his words, careful, sparse, but unmistakably warm. There is a subtle difference between a person who obeys out of fear and a person who obeys out of attachment, and that difference shaped Enoch's whole being. As the years accumulated, those who trusted him spoke of his prayers in ways that formed a pattern not unlike music. He did not simply recite, he cultivated a listening that felt like conversation. Prayer for him was an exchange. He offered his concerns, his gratitude, his questions, and the place from which he spoke expected answers that were not always immediate but were never absent. That pattern shaped the space in which his life moved, so that even his silence seemed to contain a language. People began to say that Enoch was different not because he declared himself so, but because his life suggested a possibility for humanity, that mortal life need not be exhausted by the limits of mortality. That idea was dangerous to some and exhilarating to others. It raised questions about destiny and the boundaries of human existence, and it asked the community to imagine what faith might allow beyond a strictly linear life. The thought of a different ending to life's story held a magnetic power that drew people toward stories and speculation. In the midst of this, Enoch's relationship with his family remained rooted in ordinary domesticity. He loved his kin with an attention that was tender and grounding. He laughed with them, mourned with them, and performed his obligations with a humility that did not diminish his convictions. Family ties kept him human in ways that cosmic experience might otherwise have eroded. This balance between the intimate day-to-day and the vast interior life preserved his feet on the ground even as his gaze lifted. So when the narrative begins to speak of an ascension, it is not as if Enoch floated away from a life of domestic responsibilities without consequence. The idea of being taken up carries weight precisely because of what is left behind: children who remember the exact way he folded his garments, neighbors who recall his habit of returning borrowed tools at dusk, a town that had quietly shifted toward mercy because of his presence. These small, stubborn facts anchor any account of departure in human reality, reminding us that transcendence touches the world through particular, irreplaceable lives. To imagine the ascension is to imagine a scene where the everyday and the transcendent meet at a doorway. Enoch did not climb a ladder built of clouds, nor did he ascend in sudden blinding triumph in the way legends sometimes depict. The story that has traveled down generations describes a walk towards some threshold. He walked and the world responded, as if the universe itself adjusted to the presence of a life aligned with what is true and good. It is this mutuality, person and cosmos acknowledging each other, that gives the ascension its most compelling drama. There is a moment often described as both intimate and cosmic: Enoch's final steps. The air itself seems to taste of something older, like the trace of him heard in childhood. Those who witnessed his leaving describe him not as leaving hurriedly but as moving with calm deliberation, with certainty that his steps had meaning beyond their mere locomotion. This was betrayal of ordinary endings, death as a curtain to be drawn firmly and finally. Instead, his leaving unfolded like a promise kept, not a loss imposed. Angels, as the narrative tradition expands, encircled him not as armed battalions but as witnesses to a covenant fulfilled. They danced at the edges of perception for those with sight to see, and for those without, their presence was felt like a change of season, subtle, profound, and irreversible. Enoch stepped into a company that felt like home, and yet this home was not simply another place displaced from earth. It was the consummation of a relationship that had been cultivated day by day. The ascension was not an escape but a homecoming. Different tellers emphasize different details. Some speak of a brightness that was gentle rather than overwhelming, a kind of luminescence that revealed rather than erased the contours of being. Others reflect on the silence into which voices were folded, a silence that did not kill speech but entrusted it to a deeper hearing. Both images point to a transition that transforms perception rather than annihilating the past. It is an enlargement of the senses, a retuning, where everything known is made richer by a new context. As the story spread, theologians and poets began to unpack what the ascension might mean for the living. To them, Enoch's being taken up suggested a reinterpretation of death itself. Death could be more than a simple end, it could be a threshold where relationship gains another form. This did not erase grief or the experience of loss, it reframed them. If one life could be ritually and mysteriously continued beyond the grave, then perhaps the shape of mourning needed to include elements of awe and expectation as well. The transformations of language that followed were telling. Prayer books adapted phrases, orators found new metaphors, and artists painted light in ways that tried to approximate a reality beyond pigments. Enoch became less a person to be remembered in the narrow registers of ancestry and more an icon through which communities could imagine a world in which the boundary between mortal and divine was porous. This kind of idea has consequences. It reshapes the moral imagination of a people and invites them to recalibrate the way they live in anticipation of something beyond the visible. Yet there remained skepticism and opposition, naturally. Some leaders feared that making such a story central could disrupt social order or introduce complacency about duty and justice. Others worried that it would encourage escapism, a turning away from the imperative to tend to real needs around them. Those concerns mattered. Enoch's ascension, if discussed without care, could be used both to comfort and to evade responsibility. Communities had to wrestle with how to hold an inspiring story without letting it become a refuge from the hard work of the present. In answers to such concerns, the memory of Enoch's continued attentiveness to earthly obligations became crucial. People insisted on telling the small details of his life, the way he stood with the marginalized, the days he fasted and the nights he stayed awake to counsel the troubled. Such details functioned as ethical guardrails, reminding the faithful that transcendence requires a foundation in justice and humility. The Ascension, then, became a narrative that called for imitation of character rather than mere admiration of spectacle. Beyond the local community, the figure of Enoch resonated with a wider imagination about human destiny. Philosophers and mystics pondered whether his ascent implied a particular anthropology, a statement about what humans are capable of becoming. Was Enoch a singular exception, an anomaly in the great current of mortal life, or was his experience an invitation to a potential universal transformation? These questions launched centuries of reflection that would not easily be resolved, but they kept the story alive as an object of wonder. The texts that preserved Enoch's story multiplied and diversified. Some were concise and reverent, others expansive and speculative, and still others laced the tale with allegory and moral instruction. Each retelling added a layer of interpretation, sometimes illuminated, other times clouded, but always animated by the original image of a man taken into the presence of God. Storytellers fed on the mystery, stretching it into sermons and songs, into liturgies and private devotions. The diversity of the record is itself a testimony to the story's generative power. Artists found in Enoch an inexhaustible motif, the line between earth and heaven, the human figure framed by cosmic light, the act of walking as a symbol of fidelity. Painters massed pigments to create a sense of passage, sculptors carved descent into stone, and poets filled pages with language that tried to match the ineffable. None of these attempts could claim to capture the actual moment, but each one contributed to a collective imagining that kept the narrative from fossilizing. The picture of Enoch became a mirror in which society saw a reflection of their hopes about life after death. Meanwhile, ordinary people carried small relics of the story in their pockets and memories. Folk songs described Enoch's last walk in cadence that could be sung to children, and proverbs grew that inspired acts of mercy, illuminating how an ancient narrative can become a moral lever within daily life. A story like this operates on two planes. It is at once an ethereal vision and a practical guide. Communities learn to enact the story in rituals of mourning, in rites of passage, and in the ways they teach the young to value continuity over fragmentary gains. Theological debates arose, as they always do when a story claims to reveal something about divine activity. Some said Enoch's ascension showed that human beings could be taken up without dying in the ordinary sense. Others argued that the ascension was symbolic language for being transformed by God in a profound spiritual way, and that the scriptural language should not be pressed too literally. Both positions influenced how communities lived and prayed, and those debates often reflected deeper disagreements about the nature of prophecy, miracle, and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. In the midst of those debates, there arose a quieter, existential inquiry: what does it mean for a life to be taken by God? Is it an eclipse of self, or a fulfillment of self? The answer to that question depends on how one conceives of identity. For Enoch, the narrative suggests, it was neither annihilation nor mere absorption. Rather, his life was fulfilled, extended into a wider fellowship. The ascension signified continuity, an ongoing personal story that entered a more expansive context without losing its particularity. People who mourned pressed their fingers against that particularity and found solace. It is one thing to believe in an abstract continuation after death and another to imagine a beloved person still recognizably themselves in some fuller presence. Survivors held onto the idea that Enoch retained the qualities they loved: his humor, his patience, his quiet insistence on goodness. That possibility softened grief without diminishing its seriousness. If anything, it made mourning more complex. Grief could now coexist with hope in a single, sometimes contradictory space. The image of Enoch walking with divine companions also sparked imaginations about the format of postmortal existence. Would such a life be one of endless praise, or would it include the same textures of curiosity and learning that showed up in his earthly years? The accounts suggest the latter. Enoch's continuation seems to involve an expansion of understanding as well as an intensification of love. This idea reassured those who feared that heaven might be a place of static sameness. Instead, the ascension implied growth without exhaustion, discovery without loss. Legends also wove in encounters with otherworldly beings who greeted Enoch not as a stranger but as kin. Angels, in particular, are often portrayed not merely as servants but as companions and teachers who share in the marvel of a life that bridges worlds. These companions do not erase Enoch's own voice, they amplify it, offering perspectives and responsibilities that move beyond what he had known. That companionship suggests that ascension is relational, a joining into a community that is both familiar and wondrously new. Other narratives stretch the imagination further, picturing Enoch's ascent as a passage through layers of reality, each with its own character and moral test. He moves through thresholds where the weight of earthly sin is assessed and the brightness of divine truth is revealed. These scenes are not meant to frighten but to dramatize the reality that continuity with God demands moral clarity. The journey refines rather than repels, and in that refinement Enoch's life is finally vindicated. Throughout these portrayals, language often reaches for paradox. Writers speak of Enoch as both dead and alive, both gone and present, teaching the living how to hold contradictory truths. This paradox is not a mere intellectual trick, it mirrors the lived experience of those who grieve yet hope. The ascension becomes a theological tool for navigating tension, an instrument that allows people to articulate the complex reality of faith in the face of mortality. Counselors and sages drew practical lessons from Enoch's life for those who faced death in their own families. They recommended ways to tell the story to children, ways to prepare believers for their own end, and ways to commemorate departures as transitions rather than as final, meaningless erasures. Rituals formed from such advice carried forward the notion that to walk with God could be taught as a habit of life, simple and portable, practiced in both tiny kindnesses and large sacrifices. This pedagogy of death and life shaped cultural practices around how communities honored the dead. The motif of walking permeated other parts of religious vocabulary. Pilgrimage, for example, began to be understood not only as a movement through geographic space, but as a reenactment of a life oriented toward the sacred. Those who set out on journeys carried the figure of Enoch in their hearts as a model of the spiritual traveler. The practice of pilgrimage became a tacit way of rehearsing the possibility of an ascension, a slow training in letting go and leaning into what is beyond sight. Poets found new metaphors in his story, and the language of ascent seeped into songs that lingered on the lips of the old. A single line about a man taken by the dawn could become a refrain that comforted generations. Such repetition does not fatigue meaning, rather, it deepens it. Over time, the poetry of the Ascension taught people to attend to dawn as a kind of sacrament, a daily reminder that the ordinary might be animated by the sacred. Stories of Enoch also began to influence how people understood prophecy. If an ordinary man could be taken because he walked with God, then perhaps the gift of prophecy was not exclusively the preserve of charismatic leaders but could be the natural fruit of a life lived attentively. This democratization of spiritual potential was, in some circles, liberating. It proposed that prophecy, like compassion, grows in ordinary soil and should be recognized wherever faithful life appears. In some traditions, Enoch is said to have been shown the structure of the cosmos, the layers of heaven, the courses of stars, and the ways in which divine justice works through history. These accounts treat the ascension almost like an education, an initiation into truths previously hidden to human eyes. The details vary wildly, but the underlying message is steady. The universe contains order and meaning that can be glimpsed when one is granted access to higher knowledge. Such visions comforted those who feared chaos and reassured them that there is a divine logic to the world. Yet it is important to remember that not every narrative stresses cosmic revelation. Many prefer the subtle, human-scaled story of a man who walked and was received. Those retellings keep the focus intimate, the last words Enoch might have said, the way his eyes met a friend's, the small acts that defined him. Keeping the tale grounded in human detail prevents it from becoming only an esoteric treatise and ensures that its primary audience remains those who live ordinary lives and seek meaning within them. The story's endurance owes much to its capacity for multiple readings. For some, Enoch is a moral exemplar. For others, he is a sign of hope beyond the finality of grief. For mystics, he is an initiate into the hidden structure of being. For historians, he is a marker of how ancient people understood life and death. Each reading coexists with the others, and this plurality is part of the narrative's strength. It allows communities to appropriate the story in ways that speak to their most pressing yearnings. As centuries pass, the Ascension's imagery adapts to new cultural languages. Medieval scribes illuminated manuscripts with Enoch portrayed almost like a pilgrim in a celestial landscape. Renaissance painters recast him in humanist light, emphasizing form and proportion as if to say that the human body itself is beloved. Modern writers find in his walk a metaphor for ethical courage and environmental care, imagining his steps as an example of a life that treats creation as a sacred charge. Each era finds a motif that helps it to hear the story anew. Despite these adaptations, certain core tensions remain unresolved. Is Enoch a prototype for every believer or a unique case? Does his ascension announce a pattern for the cosmic order or an exceptional exception? Such tensions fuel debate rather than exhaustion. They encourage dialogue and force communities to think carefully about how to balance particular claims with universal hopes. The vitality of the story is partly its ability to generate questions that keep faith reflective instead of complacent. The spiritual disciplines that grew in the wake of the Ascension were not uniform. Some saw his life as a call to contemplative solitude, practicing prolonged prayer and inward listening. Others heard an imperative for active compassion, emphasizing public works and social justice. Yet even with divergent emphases, both groups typically agreed that the underlying posture was attentiveness, a way of being present to people, to God, and to the created order. Enoch's example thus undergirded both quiet and active expressions of faith. Communities that embraced the story also developed practical rituals for remembering Enoch. There arose feast days, vigils, and communal readings that renewed the tale in seasonal cycles. These observances were less about spectacle and more about culture-making. They taught children how to listen, they trained adults in the art of patience, and they gave mourners a script for their grief. In time, the acts of remembrance themselves became a way of walking, small habitual practices that formed people into a pattern of life. It is easy to imagine that such a story would quickly ossify into dogma, but the living quality of the narrative often prevented that. Because Enoch's ascension resonates with so many dimensions of human longing, curiosity, justice, companionship, and transcendence, it continually invites renewal. People who wrestle with doubt are drawn back in precisely because the story does not provide easy answers, it provides images that sustain ongoing conversation. That openness keeps the narrative from calcifying into a single, rigid interpretation. Other traditions took Enoch's story and merged it with older cosmologies, creating syncretic forms that carried the core motif into new contexts. In such syncretism, the ascension becomes a universal archetype, one of crossing a border into a world where the rules differ and where moral courage is rewarded. These cross-cultural adaptations can sometimes dilute specific theological claims, but they also reveal the tale's capacity to speak to broadly human concerns about destiny and the meaning of a life well lived. The richness of later retellings sometimes introduced characters and episodes that were not in the earliest records. These additions function like coral growth on a rock, accumulative, intricate, and sometimes ornate. They offer detail that fans of imagery relish and that provide texture to a narrative otherwise lean in its ancient form. In listening to these later layers, one hears not only the original story but also the chorus of generations who layered their own longings over it. One recurring image in many retellings is the notion of a pilgrimage that becomes literalized in the Ascension. Enoch's journey toward God traces a path that locally echoes the Pilgrim's Road. This imagery creates a didactic resonance. Living a life worthy of being taken up requires deliberate motion toward a moral horizon. The path itself becomes a moral curriculum. The terrain, rocky, flat, and steep, teaches endurance, humility, and joy. In this sense, the Ascension is a map as much as it is an event. The portrayal of the heavens in these narratives is often paradoxically intimate. They are described not as cold mechanics of celestial administration but as spheres warm with relationship, each layer a chord of affection and purpose. Enoch, who had practiced relationship with neighbors and kin, is thus welcomed into continuity rather than into alien bureaucracy. If heaven is relational, then the Ascension tells us that the ultimate reality is less a place to be conquered than a home to be embraced. There are also accounts that emphasize Enoch's role as an intermediary figure. In these tellings, his ascent is not merely a personal culmination but a ministry to future generations, a model that mediates between finite human practice and infinite divine possibility. This mediatorial role gives the Ascension a social dimension. Enoch becomes a spiritual ancestor who continues to shape moral imagination after his departure. His story then functions not only as comfort but as instruction. Over time, the notion of being taken by God acquired multiple legal and moral analogs. People began to think of being taken not just as a miraculous event but as a metaphor for lives wholly surrendered to service. Martyrs, reformers, and saints in many eras were described in language reminiscent of Enoch, taken by convictions so powerful that their lives, even in death, seemed to echo a form of continuation. This rhetorical use demonstrates how a single story can inform an entire vocabulary of virtue. We can see too how the Ascension affected artful imaginations about the cosmos. Astronomers, poets, and clerics might speak of stars with a reverence that mingled scientific curiosity and theological wonder. The sky, once a tapestry of signs for navigators, was now also a theater of moral symbolism. Thus the heavens became not only a domain for measurement but also a landscape for meaning. Enoch's upward steps invited readers and listeners to view the cosmos as a place saturated with narrative, not merely a mechanism. Children's tales softened the more metaphysical edges of the story and painted Enoch's walk with whimsical light. In lullabies and bedtime tellings, his ascent was a gentle adventure, a reassurance that faithful living leads to steady outcomes that are kind rather than frightening. These versions did the crucial work of translating complex theology into language of trust for the young. They became the seeds from which adult reflection would later grow, carrying with them an early ethical imagination. Intellectual critics sometimes mistrusted such simplifications, arguing they risked flattening the depth of the original story. Yet even critics had to admit that the core narrative contained a surprising elasticity. It could bend to accommodate catechesis for the young and rigorous discourse for scholars without breaking. This flexibility is no accident. It is the hallmark of stories that resonate with archetypal human concerns. Enoch's ascension speaks to our deepest uncertainties about the boundaries of life, and that is why it remains fertile ground for thought. The personal resonance of the ascension is also important. People who struggled with their own mortality found in Enoch's story a kind of courage to face the unknown. For patients and families confronting terminal illness, the tale offered a different vocabulary, not escape from care but an invitation to presence, not denial of pain but a possibility that love continues into new modes of being. Medical caregivers sometimes found the narrative helpful in shaping hospices and rituals that honored both suffering and hope. There was a pastoral use to the story that extended beyond mere doctrine. There were moments when the story of Enoch sparked controversy or even persecution. In some epics, assertions about miraculous ascensions were used by authorities to consolidate power or to discredit dissenters. The story's malleability made it both a tool and a threat. Yet it persisted through adversity, partly because its message was not easily co-opted into simple political ends. Its ethical demands always pushed back against authoritarian uses, calling instead for integrity and relationality that resist domination. As centuries turned into millennia, the story migrated into literature in ways that made it both sacred and secular. Novelists used Enoch's figure to explore themes of exile, belonging, and the human longing for transcendence. Philosophers invoked him when asking whether human beings are meant for some telos beyond accumulation and power. The ascension thus entered broader cultural conversations about what makes a life worth living. Enoch, in this way, became a cultural symbol as much as a religious one. Modern spiritual seekers sometimes reframe the ascension in psychological terms, interpreting it as a process of individuation, a movement from fragmentation to wholeness. This interpretation keeps the core image but translates it into the language of inner growth. Instead of angels, one might hear the guidance of conscience refined into clearer form. Instead of luminous heavens, one might find the integration of personality into a coherent self. This reading makes the story applicable to those who are skeptical of supernatural claims but still hungry for deep transformation. Yet even secular readings cannot completely drain the narrative of its metaphysical thrust. There remains an openness to mystery in the best interpretations, a willingness to let the story exceed tidy explanation. The presence of that mystery keeps listeners attentive, for mystery calls forth curiosity and converts it into a lasting engagement. Enoch's ascension thus acts like a lodestone for wonder. Even when its claims are translated, it still invites us toward horizons we cannot fully map. At a practical level, communities continue to use the story as a means of moral education. Preachers drew parallels between Enoch's steady life and virtues they wished to cultivate among congregations: humility, faithfulness, attentiveness, and courage in the face of social neglect. The story's narrative force helped crystallize these virtues into memorable images that people could rehearse in daily life. Moral teaching, when attached to a compelling story, becomes a living practice rather than abstract instruction. There emerged also an aesthetic appreciation for the tale's sparseness. Unlike other narratives filled with dramatic dialogues and long genealogies, Enoch's account is brief and enigmatic in its earliest form. That brevity, paradoxically, inspired a proliferation of imaginative fill-ins as artists and theologians sought to amplify the silence. The result was an interplay between what is told and what is imagined, and that interplay has produced some of the most evocative literature and art connected to his story. As pilgrims and scholars traced the narrative across languages and continents, they sometimes found surprising convergences with other cultures' tales of ascent and transformation. Such parallels hint at a shared human intuition that there is a mode of being possible to those who align themselves with goodness, and that such alignment may be rewarded in ways that transcend ordinary death. Whether these parallels emerge from shared human needs or from a deeper metaphysical truth is a question that philosophers and theologians continue to debate. In the end, perhaps this continuing debate is part of the story's point. It refuses to settle into complacent answers and invites perpetual questioning. Listeners are drawn in because the narrative does not simply hand out moral platitudes, but instead opens up a space for ongoing reflection. The ascension of Enoch becomes less a conclusion and more a threshold that life keeps returning to whenever people ask how best to live before they die. Time and again, communities revived the tale during moments of social upheaval. When empires fell or moral certainties crumbled, Enoch's story returned as a kind of moral compass. It reminded people that faithfulness in small things could yield consequences that resonate beyond immediate crises. In that function, the ascension becomes a form of cultural ballast, stabilizing hopes and redirecting energies toward long-term resilience instead of quick fixes. The human heart's hunger for signs and wonders guarantees that Enoch's narrative will never be purely historical. People want a story that bridges the mundane and the divine. They yearn to believe that their small acts of kindness are not swallowed up by oblivion but woven into something greater. Enoch's life, lived in quiet fidelity and concluded by an enigmatic ascension, answers that hunger with a narrative that is neither sentimental nor solely rational but a blend of both. In intimate conversations, listeners often return to the detail of Enoch's walk because movement implies intention. A walk suggests time spent, attention given, and direction chosen. Unlike sudden miracles that impose themselves without cost, a walk involves patient commitment. That image allows the ascension to be read as the fruit of daily perseverance rather than the result of isolated spectacle. It democratizes sanctity by implying it can be cultivated in the slow work of ordinary days. Ask anyone who has faced great loss and they will tell you that what they needed most were stories that honored both pain and hope. The narrative of Enoch provides such a story. It does not deny the reality of grief, yet it insists that there is a continuity of love that surpasses mere physical presence. This insistence does not erase the sting but transforms its shape, offering a context in which sorrow can be accompanied by awe. In that accompaniment, many find a necessary balm. Theological reflection around Enoch also touches on justice. If heaven is a realm where truth is fully recognized, then ascension raises questions about what justice looks like beyond death. Some traditions interpret Enoch's being taken as a sign that God takes note of faithful endurance amid injustice. This view offers a moral consolation, that endurance in the face of wrong has value beyond the immediate outcomes. It is a claim about divine attentiveness and ultimate rectification that can sustain those who labor for justice today. It is worth saying, too, that the narrative has an ecological resonance. To walk with God is to walk as a steward of creation, and in many retellings Enoch's attentiveness extends to the natural world. His steps are gentle on the earth, and his prayers include care for creatures and lands. In an era when environmental degradation looms large, this aspect of the story has reclaimed urgency. People now hear Enoch's walk as a call to ecological responsibility, making the ascension relevant to contemporary crises. Scholars who study the text note its capacity to be both formidable and intimate, cosmic in reach and domestic in detail. That dual quality makes Enoch's story a unique gem in the treasury of ancient narratives. It is not purely myth nor merely history, it is a living thing that continues to feed imaginations. Each age rediscovers it with new concerns, and that rediscovery itself becomes part of the narrative's long life. Music composers, too, found in Enoch a theme for composition. Hymns and cantatas sought to translate the slow, reverent movement of his life into melodic lines that could lift communities in worship. Music's capacity to inhabit silence and to shape time made it a natural ally to a tale that is often as much about presence as it is about event. Listening to such compositions, congregations could feel the story in their bodies as well as their minds. As modern readers approach Enoch's story, they must navigate a forest of translations, commentaries, and apocryphal expansions. Some texts are careful and reserved, others are radiant with imaginative detail. The multiplicity can be bewildering, but it also offers a plural banquet of ways to encounter the tale. Each text invites readers to taste a slightly different flavor of the same essential meal. The conviction that a life lived in step with the divine yields a continuation that reshapes how we think about death. Personal testimonies sometimes mirror the Enoch narrative in surprising ways. People report experiences that they cannot easily classify: dreams, near-death encounters, sudden intuitive awakenings, and they often frame these in language akin to being taken up. Such testimonies are fraught with subjectivity, yet they show how the Enoch motif functions as a template for interpreting extraordinary experience. The story thus provides a vocabulary for those who encounter liminal moments and wish to describe them within a moral and spiritual frame. In communal worship across ages, the story functions as a mirror of aspiration. Congregations read the tale not to entertain but to be formed. In sermons and liturgy, Enoch's walk is presented as an ethic to be embodied, a summons to faithful presence that anticipates a fuller communion. Worship shapes people not only through doctrine but through habit, and the ascension becomes a habit-shaping narrative, one that moves souls toward continual fidelity. There are darker appropriations, too, where the image of being taken is twisted into sublimating human agency or excusing neglect. Critics have long warned about any narrative that could be co-opted to soothe the conscience while allowing injustice to persist. Those cautions are necessary because stories can be used to pacify rather than to motivate. The challenge for communities is to keep the ascension tied to responsibility so it becomes an impetus for action rather than a sedative for conscience. Across the arts, the ascension has functioned as a profound symbol of transformation. Filmmakers and novelists borrow the motif to explore human transcendence, often in secular settings, and in doing so they reveal how deeply embedded the story is in cultural imagination. These retellings may abstract the supernatural elements, but they preserve the psychological truth. Transformation involves leaving behind limited versions of self and entering into a larger story. The metaphor remains potent whether or not one believes in literal angels. In the quieter moments of reflection, believers often return to the question of intimacy. What made Enoch walk with God in such a way that he could be received? Was it extraordinary virtue, some unique calling, or simply a relentless practice of attention? The narrative tends to emphasize practice, persistent humility, habitual prayer, and moral courage. This emphasis offers an accessible path for those who desire a similar relationship without claiming identical outcomes. Memory plays a large role in how the ascension is lived out. Communities that remember Enoch do so through stories that are retold at key rites of passage. Weddings, funerals, and coming-of-age ceremonies carry traces of the ascension's themes: fidelity, continuity, and hope. In these rites, the story becomes lived theology, a way of infusing ordinary events with larger meaning. Memory thus functions as a bridge that brings the ascension into ongoing practice. At the level of personal formation, the story prompts disciplines aimed at aligning desire with moral truth. Practices like fasting, prayer, charity, and solitude are taught as ways to cultivate the inner conditions that made Enoch's walk possible. These disciplines are not ends in themselves but means to a capacity for presence. The narrative offers a spiritual curriculum, suggesting that an ascension of sorts might be available to any life disciplined in love and truth. When skeptics challenge the historicity of the ascension, believers often respond by pointing to its existential value rather than its empirical proof. Even if one doubts the literal ascension, the story functions as a powerful metaphor for human aspiration. It shapes moral imagination, gives courage in the face of death, and sustains communities through trials. In these pragmatic ways, the narrative operates independently of certainties about its factuality, offering meaning to people who need a story that centers hope. The interplay between doubt and devotion surrounding Enoch is itself instructive. Doubt does not invalidate faith so much as it deepens it when engaged honestly. Those who wrestle with the story's claims and who refuse easy answers often find themselves pushed toward more mature faith, one that can hold mystery and evidence in balance. In that sense, controversy and uncertainty become productive, forcing people to think through the implications of what they claim to believe about life and afterlife. As new scientific knowledge alters how people imagine the cosmos, the ascension's metaphors shift subtly. Where once celestial spheres were the immediate language, now scientists' images of space and time enter the metaphors. The vastness of the universe can be read theologically as an even more majestic theater where relationships matter. This dialogue between science and faith enriches the story rather than diluting it, offering new linguistic and imaginative resources for those who seek to reconcile wonder with reason. In the private habit of reading, the ascension often serves as an invitation to personal narrative work. People are encouraged to write their own life stories with an eye toward continuity, asking themselves what it would mean to be taken while retaining integrity. This inward turn yields practical changes, more deliberate decisions, deeper commitments, and an altered sense of legacy. The story becomes a formative force, reshaping how people prioritize time and energy in light of an imagined continuum. There is also a political dimension to the tale. Leaders who are reminded by Enoch's example of the virtue of listening and of walking alongside people rather than above them sometimes adjust policies and cultures accordingly. The story subtly resists authoritarian posturing by valorizing a life that is embedded within the social fabric. Such political consequences may be indirect, but they are real. Narratives shape character, and character shapes public life. Mystics sometimes return to the image of Enoch as a model for contemplative union. In their practices, ascent is pictured as deepening presence in God, not as escape from the world but as a reorientation that allows one to love the world more sacrificially. This understanding bridges mysticism and moral action. The deeper the union, the more compelling the call to serve. There is a sweet reciprocity in that idea. Communion with God and love for neighbor reinforce one another. Even as the story acquires global reach, it remains rooted in the particularities of Enoch's context. That rootedness prevents the tale from floating into abstract platitude. The small details, the markets, the family names, the habitual acts of neighborliness, anchor the ascension in human history. The tale's paradox is that it teaches cosmic truths through the channel of the smallest acts, showing how the sublime can be hinted at in daily loyalty. At the level of communal identity, some groups build entire liturgical calendars around the story. The rhythm of the year becomes a reenactment of the pilgrimage of life, with Enoch's ascension serving as a recurring reminder of the possibility of divine fellowship. These ritual cycles cultivate a steady, communal expectation that life is a walk not merely toward death but toward a final, revelatory communion. The calendar thus functions as a sustained pedagogical device. Finally, there is the personal testimony that lingers, an old woman who remembers being told the story by her grandmother, a young man who found courage in the image of a life taken because it was lived rightly, a scholar who continues to debate its implications. These lives, small and diverse, testify to how stories like Enoch shaped countless histories in quiet ways. Each testimony, simple and particular, becomes a continuing thread in the tapestry of a narrative that refuses to be reduced to a single lesson. In that ongoing tapestry, the Ascension remains a living image, not a closed book but a doorway that invites motion. It asks listeners to consider what it means to walk with care, to orient life toward grace, and to imagine an ending that opens into relationship rather than final absence. For those who walk this way, whether they expect a literal ascension or a symbolic one, the journey matters. The story of Enoch keeps speaking because it meets a human need to think beyond the bare facts of mortality and to see life as a path of meaning that might, at its end, be received into something vast and loving. For many, the ascension isn't an ending but a path full of meaning. Subscribe and write in the comments if it moves you more as a real promise or as a symbol of hope and connection.